close your eyes or let them go soft and heavy and just breathe for a moment. You don't have to do anything right now. You don't have to solve anything or plan anything or remember anything important. The only thing you need to do, the only thing I am asking of you tonight, is to let yourself be carried somewhere quiet, somewhere that smells faintly like old cartridges in summer rain. We're going somewhere together tonight, somewhere that exists in the space between nostalgia and mystery, between childhood wonder and the strange, beautiful depth that was always hiding just beneath the surface of something you thought you knew completely. Tonight, we're going back to Pokemon. Not the Pokemon of tournaments and trading cards and carefully calculated IV spreads, though there's nothing wrong with any of that. No, tonight, we're going back to the Pokemon of flickering Game Boy screens and schoolyard rumors. The Pokemon of a boy crouched in a field, watching a beetle push its way through the grass. The Pokemon of a generation of children who looked at a simple 8-bit world and saw something infinite and mysterious and alive. We're going to spend the next 3 hours exploring the hidden places, the myths and the truths and the half-truths that blur together in that special way they only can when a piece of art has genuinely touched millions of people and seeped into the shared dream of a generation. There are secrets in these games, real ones, stranger than most people know. There are theories and legends and mysteries that the creators themselves have never fully explained. There are episodes that were never meant to be seen, Pokemon that were never meant to exist, and a lore so quietly, devastatingly dark that most players walked right past it without ever knowing what they were standing in. So get comfortable. Pull whatever blanket or pillow you love most close to you. Let your breathing slow to its natural pace. Let your shoulders drop and your jaw unclench, and your hands rest open and soft at your sides. I'll take you through all of it, slowly, gently, one mystery at a time. By the time we're done, you'll have traveled through the origin of an entire world, through banned television, through glitches that broke the rules of what a video game could be, through a war that was never spoken of, but left its scars on every town in Kanto. You'll have visited the darkest corners of the Pokédex, the strangest myths of the playground, and the quiet, haunted truth of a game created by a man who simply wanted to share something beautiful. All of that is waiting for you. For now, just breathe. Let's begin. Part 1. The Origin of a Dream. Satoshi Tajiri and the world he built from a field. There's a town called Machida. It sits on the western edge of Tokyo, in that blurry transitional zone where the great city finally loosens its grip and gives way to something older and quieter. Today, Machida is thoroughly urban, dense with shops and apartment buildings and the constant low hum of a modern Japanese city. But in the late 1960s, when a boy named Satoshi Tajiri was growing up there, Machida was something different. It was a place that existed on the edge. The suburbs were still genuinely near nature. Between the housing developments and the streets, there were still fields, there were still forests. There were still rivers and ponds and all the secret, muddy, extraordinary places that children instinctively know are theirs. Satoshi Tajiri loved insects, not in the way that some children have a passing interest in butterflies or find a beetle charming for an afternoon. Satoshi Tajiri loved insects the way that some people love art or music or mathematics, with a consuming, organizing passion that shaped the way he moved through the world. He knew their names, their habits, their hiding places. He knew which ones emerged after rain and which ones preferred the dry edges of stone walls. He knew which logs to lift and which pools to look into and which branches in which season would have exactly what he was looking for. His neighbors called him Dr. Bug. He would spend entire days out in the fields and forests around Machida, hunting, collecting, observing. He kept his cages in jars and boxes and notebooks filled with careful drawings and observations. The natural world around him wasn't a backdrop, it was a living system he was actively learning to read, and he loved every part of it. Then something began to change. It happened slowly, the way urban change always does, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the steady accumulation of small losses. A field became a parking lot. A forest became a housing development. A river was drained and rerouted. The network of wild places that Satoshi had explored and mapped and memorized over years of childhood began to disappear, replaced by concrete and tarmac and the perfectly organized monotony of modern suburban development. By the time he was a teenager, most of the places he had loved were gone. This is a story that many people know in one form or another. The loss of the wild spaces of childhood, the way that the modern world slowly closes in on the places that mattered most when you were young. But for Satoshi Tajiri, this loss didn't become merely a source of private grief. It became the engine of something extraordinary. If the fields were gone, he would build new ones. If the places where children could explore and collect and discover were disappearing from the real world, he would find a way to put them somewhere that could never be paved over. But that was still years away. First, Satoshi Tajiri had to become someone capable of building a world. In his teenage years, Satoshi discovered video games, and they hit him with some of the same organizing force that insects once had. He became obsessed with arcades, with the buzzing rooms full of machines that were still relatively new and still carried something of the electric thrill of the genuinely novel. He was good at games, and more importantly, he wanted to understand how they worked, not just to play them, but to take them apart, mentally, and see the mechanics underneath. He was not at this point what anyone would call a model student. He attended school erratically, found most of what was being taught there deeply uninteresting, and spent a significant portion of his energy on his two obsessions: games and, still, the memory of the natural world he had grown up in. Teachers found him difficult. His future seemed uncertain. What nobody knew yet was that Satoshi Tajiri had a specific type of mind, the kind that can hold enormous complexity in a single sustained vision, the kind that doesn't flourish in the structured repetition of conventional schooling, but comes absolutely alive when given a problem it finds genuinely interesting. He found that problem eventually in a magazine. Not a magazine he read, a magazine he made. In 1983, when Satoshi Tajiri was 18 years old, he started a self-published gaming magazine called Game Freak. The name is important, not because it was obviously the name of a future legendary game studio, but because it tells you something about the spirit of the thing. This wasn't a polished professional production. It was something made by hand by someone who cared enormously with whatever resources were available. Tajiri wrote it himself, laid it out himself, had it printed in small runs, and sold it at gaming conventions and shops. Game Freak was a fanzine, a labor of love that existed entirely because Tajiri wanted it to exist. He wrote reviews, analysis, guides, opinions. He covered the games he loved with the kind of depth and care that distinguished a real enthusiast from a casual consumer. And the magazine found its audience, small but passionate, because genuine enthusiasm is always recognizable, and people who love something tend to find each other. One of the people who found Game Freak was a young artist named Ken Sugimori. Ken Sugimori was also 18, also deeply interested in games and, crucially, possessed of an extraordinary artistic gift that complemented Tajiri's visionary, analytical mind. The two became close friends and collaborators, a partnership that would, in time, become the creative heart of one of the most successful entertainment properties in human history. Sugimori began contributing illustrations to Game Freak. His style was distinctive: clean lines, warm colors, creatures and characters that felt simultaneously fantastical and approachable, alive with personality without being overwhelming. You know his work. Everyone does, even if they don't know the name. He designed Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle. He designed Pikachu. He designed the original 151 Pokemon, all of them, and they all carry the signature of a single artistic mind working at the peak of its creative powers. But that was still years away. For now, there was just the magazine, and the friendship, and the slow gathering of an idea. The idea came from a piece of hardware. In 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy. It was not by any technical measure an impressive machine. It had a small, blurry, green-tinted screen. It had limited processing power. Its graphics were primitive, even by the standards of its day. It was, in many ways, a deliberately humble device designed for portability over performance, for the child's pocket over the living room television. But the Game Boy came with something that caught Satoshi Tajiri's attention and never let go: the link cable. The link cable was a simple accessory, a short cable that could connect two Game Boys together, allowing them to interact in various ways depending on the game. Trading items, racing, competing. Two small machines speaking to each other through a physical tether. And Satoshi Tajiri looked at this cable and had one of those visions that changes everything. He imagined data moving through that cable the way insects moved through grass. Little creatures crawling from one world into another, traveling along a wire the way a beetle travels along a stem. He imagined children connecting their Game Boys and sending their collected creatures back and forth, building collections, trading rare finds, showing each other things they'd never seen. He imagined that the same instinct that had driven him through the fields of Machida as a child, the hunter's instinct, the collector's instinct, the joy of finding something rare and the pride of adding it to your collection, could be placed inside a game. And not just inside a game, but inside a game that existed between two players, in the wire connecting them, in the social act of trading and sharing and competing. The fields were gone. But the link cable was a new kind of field, and Satoshi Tajiri was going to fill it. He pitched the idea to Nintendo in 1990. The pitch was for what he was calling, at that point, Capsule Monsters. A game where you captured small creatures and trained them and traded them through the link cable. Nintendo was interested, but cautiously so. The concept was unusual. It didn't fit neatly into any existing category. And Tajiri was not yet an established developer with a track record of commercial success to point to. But Nintendo, to its enduring credit, saw something in the vision. They offered support. Not a large development budget, not a guarantee of publication, but access to development tools and a relationship that would allow Tajiri to develop the game. He went home and started building a world. What followed was 6 years that, depending on your perspective, were either inspiring or harrowing, or both simultaneously. Game Freak, now a small development studio rather than a magazine with a handful of programmers and designers led by Tajiri and Sugimori, worked on the game that would become Pokémon through a period of extraordinary difficulty. There was almost no money. There were months when the small team worked without salaries, surviving on determination and the shared conviction that what they were making was worth making. Tajiri himself reportedly did not take a salary for the entirety of the development period. Whatever income Game Freak managed to generate went back into the project. People left. The original team shrank. There were points where the project seemed likely to die, not because the vision had failed, but simply because the resources to keep going were running out. Nintendo, for its part, periodically checked in and periodically found reason to be concerned. The game was taking far longer than anticipated. The scope kept expanding. Tajiri kept adding things. More creatures, more systems, more depth. The game that had started as a relatively simple concept was becoming something more complex and more ambitious with every passing year. There were internal discussions at Nintendo about whether the project should simply be canceled. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario and Donkey Kong and one of the most important figures in the history of gaming, reportedly advocated strongly for continuing to support Game Freak and allow Tajiri to finish what he'd started. The details of those internal conversations are not fully public, but the outcome is one of the most consequential decisions in the history of entertainment. Pokémon was not canceled. It was allowed to be finished. Pokémon Red and Green launched in Japan on February 27, 1996. The reception was not immediate explosive success. The game sold reasonably well, but they were not the obvious cultural phenomenon they would become. The reviews were generally positive, but not universally enthusiastic. Some critics found the game too slow, too simple, too much of a children's product to take seriously. Then something happened that Satoshi Tajiri had designed the game to make happen. Children started talking to each other. The trading mechanic, the thing Tajiri had built the entire concept around, turned out to be exactly as compelling as he had imagined it would be. You couldn't catch all 151 Pokémon in a single version of the game. Red had some that Green didn't have, and vice versa. If you wanted to complete the Pokédex, if you wanted to catch them all, you had to connect with someone else. You had to trade. And trading meant talking. And talking meant showing each other what you had, and showing each other what you had meant discovering what they had that you didn't. And suddenly 2 children with link cables between their Game Boys were doing exactly what Satoshi Tajiri had done in the fields of Machida 3 decades earlier. Hunting, collecting, sharing rare finds. The game spread through schools the way good games always spread, not through advertising or media coverage, but through the irreducible appeal of something that children genuinely love. By the end of 1996, Pokémon was a cultural force in Japan. By 1998, when the games launched internationally under the titles Pokémon Red and Blue, it was spreading across the world with the unstoppable momentum of something that had tapped into a universal human instinct. The anime launched. The trading cards launched. The merchandise launched. The movies launched. And the center of all of it, the origin point of the entire vast cultural ecosystem that we now take for granted, was a boy who loved beetles, crouched in a field that no longer exists, watching the grass. There is one more detail from the origin story that deserves to linger before we move on, because it lives in the game itself, quietly, in a place that every player passes through but few ever look at closely enough to understand. The main character of the original Pokémon games, the player's avatar, the silent protagonist, is named, in the Japanese original, Satoshi. His rival, the competitive boy who pushes him and challenges him throughout the game, is named Shigeru, Satoshi Tajiri. The creator, Shigeru Miyamoto. The man who helped save the game. They're there, both of them, inside the world that one of them built and the other helped rescue. Walking through Pallet Town, standing on the threshold of a great adventure. Tajiri put them there not as a grand public statement, but as a quiet, private acknowledgement. A note in the margin. A signature in invisible ink. The game that came from a boy's love of the natural world contains, at its heart, a tiny monument to the friendship and the faith that made it possible. Breathe slowly. Let that settle. We've only just begun. Before we go any deeper into these mysteries, if you're enjoying this journey so far, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether it's a bedroom in Tokyo or a living room in Toronto or somewhere I haven't imagined yet, every comment makes me happy, and knowing that you're out there settling in for the night alongside these stories means everything. Now, let's keep going. Part 2. The secrets inside the original games. Bugs, glitches, and hidden truths. There's a strange and beautiful irony at the heart of the original Pokemon games, and it is this. The games that Satoshi Tajiri built to capture the feeling of discovering hidden things in nature are themselves full of hidden things. Not just Easter eggs or developer jokes, though those are there too, but genuine secrets, systems that don't work the way anyone intended, mechanics that behave in mysterious and sometimes wonderful ways, and a handful of moments where the game seems to crack open and show you something raw and unfinished underneath the polished surface. Some of these secrets are accidents. Some of them are the product of the extreme constraints under which the game was developed. A tiny team, limited resources, a hardware platform that demanded constant compromise. And some of them feel like something else entirely, like messages, like things that were put there or left there or allowed to remain there because somebody understood that mystery is itself a kind of magic. Let's start with the accident that became a legend. The Mew glitch has been documented extensively in the years since it was discovered. But even now, with full technical explanations available to anyone who wants them, there remains something genuinely uncanny about the experience of triggering it. Because the thing you're doing when you perform the Mew glitch is catching a Pokemon that wasn't supposed to be there. Mew was the 151st Pokemon, a small, pink, cat-like creature that was the genetic ancestor of all other Pokemon. The original, the source. It was not supposed to be catchable in the original games. The intended method of obtaining Mew was through Nintendo-sponsored events, official giveaways, special circumstances. Mew was rare not just in the game's narrative, but in the real world, a creature that required real-world effort and luck to obtain. And then children started doing something that wasn't supposed to work. The mechanics of the Mew glitch are, once you understand them, relatively straightforward. They involve a specific sequence of events. A trainer on Route 24 or 25, a long-range move, a specific submap, a menu press at a precise moment. The game's encounter-triggering system, pushed into a state it wasn't designed to handle, becomes confused about what it's supposed to summon. And what it summons in that state of confusion is Mew. The reason this works involves something fundamental about how the game stores and retrieves information. The special stat of the last Pokemon you battled determines what Pokemon you'll encounter in a wild encounter after a specific set of conditions. Mew's special stat corresponds to the value that the confused game state produces when you've performed the sequence correctly. So the game, in its bewilderment, reaches into its memory, finds the closest thing to what it's looking for, and produces a level 7 Mew, swimming there in the grass like it was always meant to be found. For the children who discovered this in schoolyards and game magazines in the late 1990s, without any of the technical explanation, it felt genuinely miraculous. The rarest Pokemon in the world, obtainable without a Nintendo event or a special cartridge, just there, waiting to be caught by anyone who knew the right sequence of actions. The word spread the way all the best secrets spread, whispered skeptically with excited disbelief. Did you hear? There's a way to catch Mew. I'm not joking, my cousin did it. Here's how you do it. The programmer who accidentally created the conditions for the Mew glitch almost certainly never intended to give millions of children the experience of catching the game's rarest creature in a patch of ordinary grass. But that's exactly what happened. And there's something about that, about the way the game's imperfections opened a door to something wonderful that feels very much in the spirit of what Pokemon was always about. Not all the secrets in Generation 1 are as charming as the Mew glitch. Some of them are simply broken. Take the move called Focus Energy. Focus Energy is a preparation move. It costs a full turn, but according to the game's description, it focuses the user's energy. The clear implication and the intended function is that it increases your Pokemon's critical hit ratio. You spend a turn charging up, and then your subsequent attacks are more likely to land a critical hit. It sounds useful. It sounds like a reasonable strategic investment. It does not work. Not in the way it's supposed to, anyway. Due to a programming error, a simple misplaced division, a single line of code that inverts what it was supposed to do, focus energy in the original generation. One games actually reduces your critical hit chance to 1/4 of its normal rate. You spend a turn debuffing yourself. You have made yourself demonstrably worse. This bug was present in all Generation 1 games, and wasn't fixed until Generation 2. For the entire lifespan of Red and Blue, every player who used focus energy was dutifully destroying their own odds of landing a critical hit while believing, entirely reasonably based on the game's own description, that they were improving them. The move Rage had a similar inverted bug. The move Pokemon Stadium has a version that actually works correctly, which created the bizarre situation where the same move, in two different versions of the same game's universe, did literally opposite things. What does this tell us? It tells us about the conditions under which these games were made. A small team working under enormous time pressure, testing as best they could, but inevitably missing things. The bugs in Generation 1 aren't embarrassments, they're fossils. Evidence of the speed and the stress and the sheer human effort that went into building something that was, despite everything, extraordinary. Then there's the mystery of Splash. Splash is perhaps the most famously useless move in Pokemon history. It is the signature move of Magikarp, the series' most celebrated example of extreme weakness. A flopping, pathetically helpless fish that cannot do anything useful until it evolves into the fearsome Gyarados at level 20. And Splash, in the English localization, does absolutely nothing. The game's text says, "But nothing happened." It has no effect. Not on the opponent, not on the user, not on the weather or the terrain, or any condition of the battle. Nothing. This is funny and intentional and fits perfectly with the comedy of Magikarp's weakness. But in the original Japanese, the move isn't called Splash at all. In Japanese, it's called Hazumu, which translates roughly as bounce or jump. And that's exactly what the Pokemon does. It bounces, it leaps, it bobs in the water. The move is a visual representation of what Magikarp actually does. Flounder about energetically without accomplishing anything. In that context, the uselessness is the joke. The Pokemon is doing its absolute best, expending genuine effort in a dramatic leap, and it doesn't help at all. There's almost something poignant about it in the original Japanese, an honest portrayal of well-intentioned futility. The English translation changed bouncing to splashing, which removed some of that nuance. A Pokemon that bounces is making an effort, while a Pokemon that splashes is merely flailing. But in either language, the joke lands because Magikarp's entire existence is a setup for Gyarados' punchline. We'll return to what that punchline might actually mean, thematically, much later in the night. There's one corner of the original Kanto map that deserves its own quiet examination, and that is the Safari Zone. The Safari Zone in Pokemon Red and Blue is a restricted area outside Fuchsia City where you can encounter rare Pokemon that appear nowhere else in the game. Tauros, Scyther, Pinsir, Kangaskhan, creatures of exceptional power or rarity, available only in this one location. To enter, you pay a fee and receive a limited number of steps. When your steps run out, you're escorted out regardless of where you are or what you were doing. The mechanics of capturing Pokemon inside the Safari Zone are completely different from the rest of the game. You can't use your own Pokemon to battle wild encounters. Instead, you're given Safari Balls and a small selection of items. rocks to throw to anger Pokemon and make them easier to catch, bait to throw to calm them and make them stay longer but harder to catch. The whole system creates a different rhythm, a more uncertain, more chance-dependent style of capture. What most players didn't know and still don't know is that the Safari Zone was an absolute nightmare to program. The chance calculations for whether a Pokemon will flee or be caught, or stay or respond to bait and rocks, all of these were tuned and retuned repeatedly during development and still ended up producing results that feel genuinely random to the player in a way that wasn't entirely intentional. The Tauros encounter rate, for instance, was tuned so high that the developer testing the area's functionality caught an almost absurd number of them. This became accidentally one of the game's most noted quirks. The Pokemon anime's Ash Ketchum threw approximately 30 Safari Zone Pokeballs in the Safari Zone episode, and all 30 caught Tauros. That's why his party, for years, was disproportionately full of Tauros. Not a creative writing choice, a consequence of how the developers tested the encounter rates. There's also a famous glitch in the Safari Zone involving the Strength HM. In the original games, to obtain the Strength HM and progress through certain areas, you need to visit the Safari Zone's Rest House, where an old man will give you the item after you've walked a certain number of steps. But through a specific sequence of menu interactions, you can obtain Surf and other key items before the game intended, effectively skipping entire sections of the required progression. This glitch wasn't fixed either. Like the Mew glitch, like the focus energy bug, it persisted throughout the original game's lifespan. A small open door that the developers either didn't notice or perhaps quietly decided to leave unlocked. Before we leave the subject of Generation 1's hidden workings, there is one more thing worth pausing on. The old man in Viridian City. Early in the game, the old man who teaches you how to catch Pokemon is blocking the path north out of Viridian City. He's asleep or indisposed in some way, and you can't pass. Once you've run Professor Oak's errand and retrieved his package, the old man wakes up, teaches you the catching tutorial, and the road is open. This seems like simple game design, a gating mechanism that ensures you learn the catching mechanics before proceeding. But the old man is also, in a completely unrelated way, the key to triggering the MissingNo encounter. After the old man performs his catching tutorial, the game temporarily replaces your character's data with the old man's data. Specifically, your name, which the game uses to determine certain wild encounter tables, is swapped out for Old Man to allow the tutorial to function correctly. And when you immediately fly to Cinnabar Island and surf along its eastern coast, the game's encounter system draws on this temporarily stored name data to generate the encounters you'll face. The result, depending on your specific player name, ranges from rare and powerful high-level Pokemon to the infamous MissingNo itself, the glitch creature that should not exist, that is a hole in the game's world, that duplicates items and corrupts Hall of Fame data and behaves in every way like something that was never meant to be seen. We'll spend much more time with MissingNo later, because it deserves its own dark and quiet examination. For now, it's enough to know that it's connected, through the old man's tutorial, through the game's own necessary internal confusion, to one of the most ordinary moments in the entire game. The man who teaches you the most fundamental mechanic of Pokemon is also the one who accidentally opens the door to the game's most famous monster. Breathe. Let your body sink a little heavier. We're going somewhere darker now. Part 3, Lavender Town. The music, the myths, and the strange, quiet truth. There's a place in Kanto called Lavender Town. It sits in the middle of the map, east of Celadon, north of Fuchsia, connected to the world by a single road and a series of underground tunnels. The town itself is small and spare. A handful of buildings, a Pokemon Center, a shop with a limited inventory. There are no gym leaders here, no powerful trainers to challenge, no badge to win. In terms of mechanical progression, Lavender Town is almost a dead end, a place you pass through on the way to somewhere else. But Lavender Town has one thing that no other town in Kanto has. It has a tower. Pokemon Tower rises 7 stories above Lavender Town, and it is a graveyard. Every floor of Pokemon Tower is populated by grave markers, and every grave marker, if you press the button to examine it, tells you something about the Pokemon that was buried there. Some of the inscriptions are simple, touching. Beloved partner, dearest friend, too young to leave. The ghost Pokemon who haunt the tower. Ghastly, Haunter, Gengar, drift through the floors between the graves. The atmosphere is unmistakably, and in the context of a Nintendo game in the 1990s, startlingly funereal. There is even, if you read the optional dialogue carefully enough, a memorial for a Marowak, the mother of the baby Cubone. You've seen Wandering Kanto, the one who died protecting her child from Team Rocket. Cubone's skull helmet is not decoration. It is, the game tells you quietly, the skull of its mother. The one it lost. The one it still mourns. The Pokédex entry for Cubone in the original games reads, depending on translation. Because it never removes its skull helmet, no one has ever seen this Pokemon's real face. The skull is that of its dead mother. It cries when it sees its mother's image in the full moon. In a game marketed to children, in a game about collecting colorful creatures and winning badges. This is Lavender Town. This is what Game Freak built in the middle of Kanto. And then there's the music. The Lavender Town theme in the original Red and Blue is unlike anything else in the Pokemon soundtrack. The man who composed it is Junichi Masuda, who also composed the vast majority of the original game's music and who is now one of the senior creative figures at Game Freak. The Lavender Town theme was composed under the extreme hardware constraints of the Game Boy's sound chip, a limitation that, paradoxically, contributed to its strangeness. The chip could produce only a small number of simultaneous audio channels, and Masuda had to work within those boundaries to create the game's entire sonic world. What he created for Lavender Town is haunting in the most literal sense of the word. The theme uses a specific combination of high frequencies and unusual melodic intervals that, even when described technically, lose something in the description. It has to be heard. It sounds like something that is almost a lullaby, but is specifically, intentionally, not quite one. It has the shape of something comforting without quite arriving at comfort. It cycles through a short, melodic loop in a way that, rather than feeling repetitive, feels patient. Waiting. Like something that has all the time in the world and knows it. It is, without qualification, one of the most effective pieces of music ever written for a video game, and it has been lodged in the collective memory of an entire generation. It is also the subject of one of the most elaborate and widely believed pieces of gaming mythology ever created. The Lavender Town Syndrome story emerged around 2010 in a now infamous post on an internet forum. The story went like this. The original Lavender Town theme, the version that appeared in the very first Japanese printing of Pokemon Red and Green before it was supposedly altered, contained a specific combination of binaural frequencies that were harmful, particularly to children whose hearing is more sensitive to high-frequency sounds than adults. The story claimed that in the weeks following the release of Pokemon Red and Green in February 1996, there was a spike in mysterious illnesses among Japanese children. Headaches, nausea, behavioral changes, and more darkly, a spike in suicides. The story claimed that Nintendo identified the Lavender Town theme as the cause, quietly altered the music for subsequent printings, and buried the whole incident. It claimed that the original frequency-laden version of the theme was out there, archived somewhere, and that listening to it was dangerous. This story is entirely false. There is no evidence, not a single piece, that any such incidents occurred in Japan in 1996. No contemporaneous Japanese news coverage, no health alerts, no Nintendo communications, no anything. The story was created whole cloth, almost certainly as a creative writing exercise that escaped its original context and took on a life of its own as internet creepypasta. The writer, whoever they were, was skilled. The story was specific and plausible sounding. It contained the right kind of technical sounding detail to be convincing to readers who didn't know enough about binaural audio to evaluate the claims critically. And the story spread and spread and spread because it attached itself to something that was genuinely true. The Lavender Town music is strange and affecting in ways that are hard to fully explain, and the town itself is darker and more melancholy than anything else in the game. And the gap between those real qualities and the cheerful, colorful world surrounding them is genuinely jarring. The legend fed on the reality. There is something worth saying here about why the Lavender Town Syndrome story was so widely believed and so enthusiastically retold. It's not that people are gullible exactly, it's that the story gave a name and a mechanism to something that people had actually experienced. A genuine, unexplained unease while playing through Lavender Town as a child. The music did something to you, even if it couldn't be articulated. The graveyard and the dead Marowak and the weeping Kubone and the ghosts on every floor. This was real, and it was affecting, and when a story came along that said, yes, that feeling was real, it was caused by specific frequencies. It was so powerful that it hurt people. Some part of the listener recognized the feeling even if it rejected the specifics. The mythology of Lavender Town is, in this sense, a document of how strongly the original game affected its audience. Junichi Masuda has spoken about the Lavender Town theme in several interviews over the years, and what he says about it is interesting precisely because of how specific his intention was. He wanted to create something melancholy without being completely sad. Something that acknowledged loss without being overwhelmed by it. He has cited the Japanese aesthetic concept of mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the gentle sadness of beautiful things that pass, as a guiding principle. Mono no aware is everywhere in Japanese art and culture. It's in the cherry blossom, which is celebrated precisely because it falls so quickly. It's in the tea ceremony's awareness of the moment's uniqueness. It's in the particular quality of light in late afternoon. And it's in the Lavender Town music. The acknowledgement that loss is real and grief is real and the things we love don't last forever, offered not as horror, but as the gentlest possible truth. For a game that was, at its heart, about the bond between a trainer and their Pokemon, the existence of Pokemon Tower is not an anomaly. It's an inevitability. If the bond is real, if the friendship and the partnership and the shared journey are genuinely meaningful, then loss is meaningful too. Pokemon die, their trainers grieve. The graveyard in the middle of the map is the honest consequence of everything the game asks you to feel about your companions. The Lavender Town music isn't malevolent. It isn't dangerous. It is perhaps one of the most honest things in the game. There are other myths attached to Lavender Town beyond the Syndrome story, and they are worth visiting briefly because some of them are genuinely interesting as cultural artifacts, even if they're no more true than the Frequencies story. The most widely known is the story of Buried Alive. The claim that somewhere in the deepest floor of Pokemon Tower, there was meant to be a battle with a creature called Buried Alive, a decayed undead trainer who had been buried in the tower and would attack the player character. The story claimed this enemy had been cut from the final game, but that data for it remained in the cartridge, accessible through hacking. Hackers have in fact found unusual and incomplete data in the Pokemon Tower sections of the game's code. There are placeholder elements and unused graphics that suggest the tower's design changed significantly during development. Whether any of this constitutes a buried alive character in any meaningful sense is unclear, but the incompleteness of the data is real, and incompleteness is always fertile ground for mythology. The White Hand legend claimed that a specific sequence of moves within Pokemon Tower could trigger a special encounter with a ghostly figure, a disembodied hand that would ask you if you knew what it was made of. This is entirely invented, but it's inventively eerie, and it captured the imagination of children who were already genuinely unsettled by the tower. What's interesting about all of these myths is that they share a common structure. They take the genuine darkness of Lavender Town, the real graveyard, the real dead Marowak, the real haunting music, and extend it into something more extreme. They push the implications further. They imagine a version of the game that is fully as dark as its themes suggest it could be. And maybe that's the most honest thing about Pokemon mythology. It has always been reaching toward the full implications of what Game Freak actually built. Breathe. We're going somewhere even quieter now. Into the ruins of a history that the games never quite explained. Part 4. The Great War. The dark history hidden in Kanto. There are no fathers in Kanto. This is not a dramatic overstatement. Look at the player character's home in Pallet Town. A mother, a house, the memory of a name. No father present. Look at your rival's home in the same town. His parents are not discussed, and his sister is the only family member you meet. Travel through every town in Kanto, speak to every NPC, read every piece of optional dialogue, and you will find something consistent and strange. The absence of an entire generation of men. There are elderly men, there are boys and young men your own age or slightly older. There are male gym leaders, male professors, male members of Team Rocket. But the middle generation, the fathers, the men who would be in their 40s and 50s in the game's world, is almost entirely absent. For decades, players noticed this and found various explanations for it. It's a simple game. Character design is limited. It's not that significant. But then players began to look at it more carefully and to look at what the game actually says about itself. And a theory emerged that recontextualized almost everything in Kanto. There was a war. The evidence is not hidden. It's simply distributed across the game in pieces that most players never assembled together, because the game never presents them as a coherent narrative. They're background details, optional dialogue, Pokédex entries. You have to be paying a very specific kind of attention to see the shape they make together. Start with Lieutenant Surge, the gym leader of Vermilion City. Lieutenant Surge is the Lightning American, a heavily built military-style trainer who leads with electric-type Pokemon and whose gym is guarded by the need to find 2 hidden switches. His optional dialogue before the battle contains a line that is, in context, quietly devastating. He says that Pokemon have saved his life, and specifically that electric Pokemon saved him during the war. The war. He doesn't elaborate, the game doesn't elaborate. The war is simply stated as a thing that happened, as a thing that Lieutenant Surge survived, as the context for his relationship with his Pokemon. And then the game moves on, and you take his Thunder Badge, and you progress, and most players file the war under background detail and keep going. But he said it. It's there. Lieutenant Surge is explicitly a veteran. And the title, Lightning American, the first word of which suggests a nationality, an outsider, someone who came from somewhere else to fight in something, positions him not as a native of Kanto, but as a soldier who came to the region during a conflict and stayed. He's not alone. Consider the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. The Pokemon Mansion is a ruined building. Burned, collapsed in places, its floors strewn with overturned furniture and scattered papers. It is, by any reading, a place that was catastrophically and violently destroyed. The journals scattered through its rooms tell the story of Dr. Fuji's experiments to clone Mew, the creation of Mewtwo, Mewtwo's devastating escape. But the mansion itself, as a physical space, raises questions that the journals don't answer. Who burned it? When? Why was it abandoned so completely? The scientists who worked there, where did they go? The theory holds that the Pokemon Mansion was not simply abandoned after Mewtwo's escape. The timeline suggested by the journals and by the overall state of Cinnabar Island's infrastructure implies that something happened to the mansion's occupants that goes beyond a single research catastrophe. The building's total ruin, the absence of any official investigation or cleanup, the way that Team Rocket seems to have had connections to the research being done there, all of this suggests a history that was deliberately obscured. Then consider Mr. Fuji himself. Mr. Fuji lives in Lavender Town and is, by the time you meet him, a gentle, grandfatherly figure who cares for orphan Pokemon in his home. He is also, it gradually becomes clear through optional dialogue and the structure of his presence in the narrative, the Dr. Fuji who was responsible for the Mew cloning research. He built Mewtwo. He was in the mansion. And now he lives in Lavender Town, next to the graveyard, caring for lost creatures, and he appears to be living a life of quiet penance. For what? For the war research? For Mewtwo? For something he never quite articulates. The theory, and it is a theory, not something the games explicitly confirm, is that the Pokemon Mansion's research was military in nature, conducted during or in support of a conflict, and that the ethical catastrophe of creating Mewtwo was not simply a scientific curiosity but a war crime, and that Mr. Fuji, who survived, retreated to Lavender Town to spend the rest of his life in a kind of atonement, surrounded by the dead. Look at the infrastructure of Kanto, the cycling road, the underground passages connecting cities, the SS Anne docked at Vermilion carrying the cultural remnants of a society that someone is clearly trying to preserve or restore. The gym system itself, a network of powerful trainers organized into a formalized hierarchy for the regulation and testing of Pokemon battle skill. All of this is reconstruction infrastructure. The cycling road is practical and efficient in a way that suggests it was built with urgency. The underground passages have a utilitarian quality that doesn't quite match a simple civilian transportation network. The formalization of the gym system into an official league structure looks, from a certain angle, like the imposition of structure on a society that recently went through something chaotic enough to require it. Kanto, the theory suggests, is a region in recovery. Not ancient recovery, recent recovery. A generation ago at most. Long enough for children to have been born into the post-war world without direct memory of the conflict, but not long enough for the infrastructure to have evolved beyond the shapes that emergency and reconstruction imposed on it. The absent fathers aren't absent because of a design oversight. They're dead. In later Pokemon games, particularly in the 5th generation, the theme of war becomes explicit in ways that Generation 1 only implied. In Pokemon Black and White, set in the Unova region, the backstory involves a war fought 500 years before the game's events. A conflict between two brothers who, in their grief over the losses caused by their conflict, each claimed one of the legendary dragon Pokemon, Reshiram and Zekrom, which represent truth and ideals respectively. The brothers' inability to reconcile their visions for how the world should be is presented as the origin of the conflict, and the Pokemon world's fragmentation into competing ideologies is traced back to this moment. The Pokemon War in Unova is mythological in scale, filtered through legend. The Kanto War is recent enough that veterans are still alive. Lieutenant. Surge walks among you, living with what he survived. There is no canonical, complete account of what happened. Game Freak has never confirmed or denied the Great War theory in any formal way. Individual developers have occasionally made oblique references that fans interpret as confirmation or as playful acknowledgement without commitment. The theory exists in that productive space between what is implied and what is stated the space where the most interesting questions live. But here's what is true. Kanto is a world with visible wounds. It is a world where someone in a tower is grieving, where a researcher lives in a graveyard, where a soldier teaches children about electricity, where the fathers who should be there are not. Whether the explanation is war or something else, the absence is real. And the game was made by someone who grew up watching fields become parking lots, watching the living world he loved be erased by forces too large to resist. Maybe Kanto was never just a game world. Maybe it was always also an elegy. Breathe deeply. Let your body rest. We're going to leave the game itself for a while now and travel into the spaces around it, to an animation studio in Tokyo and to some stories that were made but almost never seen. Part 5, the banned episodes. What Nintendo didn't want you to In 1997, the Pokemon anime was one of the most watched children's television programs in Japan. It had launched in April of that year, following the success of the games, and it had quickly become exactly the cultural phenomenon that Nintendo and Game Freak had hoped for. Ash Ketchum, Satoshi in Japanese, and his Pikachu were traveling through Kanto, meeting Pokemon, making friends, competing in gym battles. The show was warm and funny and adventurous, and children adored it. Then, on December 16, 1997, one of the most serious incidents in the history of broadcast television occurred. The episode was called Denno Senshi Porygon, which translates approximately as Computer Warrior Porygon. The plot involved Ash and his companions traveling inside a computer system to fix a malfunctioning Pokemon transport program. And the Pokemon Porygon, a digital creature composed entirely of geometric computer data, featured prominently. At a climactic moment in the episode, Pikachu used a lightning attack, and the animators, following the industry-standard technique for creating a sense of visual impact, created a rapid strobing effect, a very fast alternation between red and blue flashing lights that lasted several seconds. That evening, 685 Japanese children were taken to hospital. Some experienced seizures. Some experienced nausea and vomiting. Some reported headaches and visual disturbances. The incident was covered extensively in the Japanese press. The anime was immediately pulled from broadcast. It did not air again for 4 months. And when it returned with the strobing sequence removed and with new guidelines about flash frequencies in animation having been quietly adopted throughout the Japanese broadcasting industry. The medical explanation for what happened involves a phenomenon called photosensitive epilepsy, which is not limited to people who have been formally diagnosed with epilepsy. Many people have a neurological sensitivity to specific types of flashing light that they have never encountered before and therefore never known about. The strobing in the Porygon episode, at the frequency and intensity it was used, was sufficient to trigger seizure-like episodes in children with this undiagnosed sensitivity. This is real. It is documented. It happened. And it changed the way animation studios around the world thought about visual effects in children's programming. The guidelines that emerged from the Porygon incident, specific limits on flash frequency, duration, and brightness in broadcast animation, are still in use today. Every time you see a seizure warning at the beginning of a video game or animated program, you are seeing the long shadow of that December evening in 1997. But here is the detail of the Porygon incident that has always struck people as profoundly unfair. Porygon did nothing. In the episode, the strobing effect was created by Pikachu's electric attack, not by anything Porygon did. Porygon was simply present, and yet Porygon, and its evolutions, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, have never been given featured roles in the anime since that episode. They appear in background shots occasionally. They are technically present in the Pokemon world. but they have never been featured in an episode that gave them significant screen time, never been given to a main character, never been acknowledged in the anime's narrative in any meaningful way. Pikachu, who created the strobing effect, is the series' mascot and has appeared in every episode of the anime for nearly 3 decades. Porygon, who was simply nearby, was quietly removed from the spotlight. The animators have never formally commented on this. The show's producers have never acknowledged the implicit exile. It simply happened, and it has continued to happen for 28 years. A quiet institutional memory of an event that nobody involved particularly wants to revisit. The Porygon incident is the most documented and significant of the Pokemon anime's controversies, but it is not the only one. There is an episode called Legend of Dratini, which aired in Japan in 1983, before the Porygon incident, and which has never been broadcast in any international market. The reason is simple. The episode involves a character who points guns at the main cast. In the episode, set in the Safari Zone, a game warden named Kaiser spends much of the runtime pointing various firearms at Ash and his companions, attempting to prevent them from finding the mythical Dratini. The guns are used for comedic effect and nobody is actually harmed, but the imagery of a character directing weapons at children was, quite reasonably, judged to be unsuitable for international broadcast. The result of this episode's absence from international programming is a continuity gap that Pokemon fans have been puzzling over for decades. When Ash's party arrives in a later episode with an inexplicable team composition, specifically featuring 30 Tauros that he supposedly captured in the Safari Zone, there is no broadcast episode that explains how he got them. Legend of Dratini was that episode. It was the Safari Zone arc that included the Tauros captures. International audiences never saw it. Ash simply arrives with 30 Tauros. No explanation given. No explanation possible, given which episode was excised. Then there's the Earthquake episode. On January 17, 1995, the Great Hanshin earthquake struck the Kobe area of Japan, killing over 6,000 people and causing catastrophic destruction. It was one of the most devastating natural disasters in modern Japanese history, and its cultural aftershocks, its influence on how Japanese society processed and depicted trauma and disaster, are extensive and ongoing. In 2011, an episode of the Pokemon anime was completed and scheduled for broadcast. The episode rivaled Destiny's arc material involving the character Ash competing in a tournament was unremarkable by the standards of the series, but it included a sequence depicting buildings collapsing and significant earthquake-like destruction. It was pulled. The episode was pulled in the days following the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011. One of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded, which generated a devastating tsunami and triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. In the immediate aftermath, the scheduled episode, with its imagery of building collapse and mass destruction, was pulled from broadcast. It aired months later, after the initial crisis had passed. This is not, strictly speaking, a ban. The episode did eventually air, and the decision to delay it was a reasonable act of editorial sensitivity rather than censorship. But it illustrates something important about the relationship between the Pokemon anime and the real world it exists in. The show is not insulated from reality. When reality produces specific catastrophes, the show responds, sometimes by pulling content, sometimes by altering scripts, sometimes in ways that aren't publicly discussed. Perhaps the most interesting banned content in the anime's history, from a narrative standpoint, is a pair of episodes from the Black and White series that were pulled shortly before their scheduled broadcast in Japan. The Team Plasma episodes, Team Plasma's Pokemon Manipulation, and a second related episode were pulled following the March 2011 Tohoku disaster and have never aired anywhere in any market. The reason given was sensitivity to the disaster. The episodes featured scenes of buildings under attack and significant structural destruction that were deemed inappropriate in the immediate aftermath of the tsunami. But the episode's non-appearance has had lasting effects on the black and white series' narrative coherence. The villain group Team Plasma, which was central to the game's storyline, had its anime presence significantly diminished by the loss of these episodes, and the narrative arcs they were meant to establish were never fully resolved in the broadcast series. The episodes exist. The animators were paid for them, the voice work was completed. They simply aren't available to be watched by any member of the public in any country on any format. They sit somewhere in a vault, complete and invisible. There is one more episode worth mentioning, though it occupies a different category from the others. Beauty and the Beach, in Japanese Holiday at Aopulco, is an episode that aired in Japan in 1997 and was not broadcast internationally for several years. When it eventually was broadcast internationally, it was in a heavily edited form. The reason for the original ban and the subsequent editing involved a sequence in which a male character, James from Team Rocket, appears wearing an inflatable female bodysuit and uses it in a contest. The humor of the sequence depends on its visual oddness, James in an exaggerated costumed form making pointed comments. In Japan, this type of cross-dressing comedy is a well-established comedic tradition, unremarkable by the standards of Japanese entertainment. For international broadcasters in the late 1990s, the sequence was deemed potentially confusing for young audiences, and the episode was withheld until an edited version could be prepared. This is, in retrospect, the mildest of the banned episode situations, but it's notable because it illustrates the cultural translation challenges that the Pokémon anime has navigated throughout its existence. What reads as straightforward comedy in one cultural context requires editorial decisions when moving to another. The anime that arrives in any given country is always, to some degree, a curated version of the anime that exists in Japan. Settle in deeper now. Let the weight of the day dissolve just a little more. We're going somewhere I particularly love. The lost world of Pokémon that almost was. Part 6. The Space World Beta. The Pokémon that never were. In November 1997, Nintendo held an event called Space World. Space World was an annual trade show where Nintendo showed off upcoming and potential products. A showcase of what was possible, what was coming, and occasionally what might never actually arrive. At Space World 1997, Nintendo showed a demo of what would eventually become Pokémon Gold and Silver. And that demo was, in almost every meaningful way, a completely different game from the one that shipped. The demo has had a complicated history. For years, it existed only in the memories of the attendees who saw it, and in low-quality photographs and brief descriptions. The specific Pokémon shown were rumored and speculated about for over 2 decades. Then, in 2018, something extraordinary happened. The demo leaked. The full ROM of the Space World, 1997 Pokémon Gold and Silver demo, an actual playable build of the game as it existed in November 1997, over a year before the finished games launched, was uploaded to the internet and spread rapidly through the Pokémon community. For the first time, players could see and play the game that almost was. What they found there was wonderful and strange and melancholy in equal measure. The most immediate and dramatic difference between the Space World demo and the final game is the roster of Pokémon. The demo contains dozens of Pokémon designs that never made it into the final game. Some of them are clearly early versions of creatures that did make it, rougher, more experimental forms of what eventually became familiar. Others are completely original designs that were at some point between 1997 and the game's 1999 release, cut entirely. There are a few that are particularly notable. The fire-type starter in the demo is a small bear with a flaming element on its body. It is unambiguously adorable, and unambiguously bears a resemblance to the finished creature Teddiursa, a small bear Pokemon that does appear in the final game, but as a normal type without fire associations. The theory that the demo's Firestarter bear and the final game's Teddiursa share DNA is plausible. That the bear design was reworked, its starter role given to Cyndaquil, and the remaining design elements repurposed into a different Pokemon. There is something quietly fascinating about this. Somewhere in the development process, a designer made a bear, gave it fire, and imagined children starting their Johto journey with this creature at their side. Then the decision was made to go a different direction, and the bear was reborn as something else, stripped of its fire, given to the background of a game it was once meant to lead. More striking still is the demo's treatment of Farfetch'd. Farfetch'd is a peculiar Pokemon. A duck carrying a spring onion stalk as a weapon, with a Pokédex entry that darkly notes that it was once nearly hunted to extinction because the leek it carries tastes good with its meat. Farfetch'd has, for most of Pokemon's history, been notable primarily for having no evolution. Most Pokemon have evolutions. Farfetch'd simply exists in its single form, presumably fighting its way through battles despite the significant handicap of being quite weak. In the Space World 1997 demo, Farfetch'd has an evolution. The evolution is called Madam in available documentation of the demo, and it is a notably different creature from Farfetch'd. More upright, more dignified, carrying its weapon with a posture that suggests experience and competence, rather than the somewhat hapless energy of its pre-evolution. Whether the name Madam was a placeholder or the intended final name isn't clear, but the design suggests a Pokemon that had been through things and come out the other side with a kind of hard-won composure. Madam was cut. Farfetch'd shipped without an evolution. Here is the almost unbearably fitting postscript. In Pokemon Sword and Shield, released 20 years after the Space World demo, Farfetch'd finally received an evolution. In the Galarian form, with a new design that emphasizes its battler qualities, Galarian Farfetch'd evolves into Sirfetch'd, a creature that, while different in its specifics from the 1997 Madam, fulfills the same narrative function. The evolution that was designed and then abandoned in 1997 was reconceived and realized in 2019. Farfetch'd had to wait 22 years for the evolution that was designed for it in the first place. There are Saiyai in the Space World demo, beta designs for what would become the legendary beasts, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. The three creatures who roam the Johto region and whose backstory, told through optional dialogue and the burned tower of Ecruteak City, involves their death in a fire and their resurrection by the legendary Ho-Oh. The demo's versions of these creatures are visibly more grotesque than the finished designs. The Suicune precursor, in particular, has been compared by some observers to a chimera, a fusion of incompatible body parts, an unsettling assemblage of animal characteristics that feels more horrifying than magical. This fits, in an interesting way, with the creature's canonical backstory. It was killed in a fire and brought back. The question of what resurrection by a legendary bird would actually produce, whether brought back to life means restored to original form, or reassembled as best as could be managed, is one the final designs politely declined to engage with. The beta designs did not politely decline. They looked like what you might expect Resurrection to actually produce. They were softened for the final game. The beta also contains Pokemon that never appeared in any form in any final game. There is a water/steel fish-type creature with a design that feels industrial and dense, a Pokemon that seems to belong to a deep, cold, metallic part of the ocean that Pokemon games rarely visit. There is a water/fire seal, a combination type that still doesn't exist in the main series games to this day, with a design that plays with the visual contradiction of something simultaneously associated with opposing elements. There is an electric tiger, referred to in available documentation as Kotora, that has a quality of compressed energy, a tightly wound design that suggests enormous power held under very tight control. None of them shipped. All of them were designed, play-tested, presumably named and given stats and movesets in the normal course of game development, and then cut. The reasons for the cuts are unknown. Budget, time, balance, artistic direction, any or all of these may have played a role. They exist now in a permanent intermediate state, real enough to have been found and named and appreciated, too incomplete to be truly part of the world they were designed for. There's something affecting about this. The Space World beta Pokemon are not, in the strict canonical sense, real Pokemon. They are drafts. They are possibilities. They belong to a version of the Pokemon world that was being considered and then revised. But people have grown genuinely fond of them, have drawn fan art of them, written fan fiction. Imagine their evolutionary lines and their Pokédex entries and the routes where they might have been encountered. They were never meant to be loved, but they are. The 1999 Space World demo, a later build, also leaked as part of the same 2018 release, fills in some of the picture between the 1997 demo and the final game. Designs had been refined, some of the more extreme elements softened. The roster was closer to what shipped, though still different in meaningful ways. You can trace in the differences between the 1997 demo, the 1999 demo, and the final game. The arc of artistic decision-making, the things that were tried, the things that were reconsidered, the things that finally survived to become the game that millions of people remember. Development is always like this. Every piece of art you love is the survivor of hundreds of decisions to cut, to change, to refine, to remove. What you see is not the whole of what was imagined. The Space World demos are simply, uniquely, a window into the discarded imaginations. The things that were considered and found wanting, or that were loved, but sacrificed for the health of the whole. They are the field that was paved over, and we found them again. Breathe slowly. Let your eyes rest. There's more to come, and it's getting stranger. Part 7. The Mew Ditto Conspiracy. What the oldest Pokemon really was. There is a theory that lives at the intersection of game lore, data analysis, and something that feels almost too elegant to be coincidental. The theory is called, in various places across the internet, the Mew Ditto theory, and it concerns the relationship between three Pokemon. Mew, the genetic ancestor of all Pokemon, Ditto, the transform Pokemon, and Mewtwo, the clone. Let's start with what the game actually tells you, because the foundation of the theory is not speculation. It is documented, verifiable game data. Mew and Ditto share a weight. Both Pokemon weigh exactly 8.8 pounds. This is, in the context of the Pokemon world, unusual. Pokemon vary enormously in weight, from Ghastly's 0.2 pounds to Snorlax's 1,014 pounds. And there is no obvious in-game reason why two specific creatures, apparently unrelated in type and design and role, should have the same precise weight. Mew and Ditto are both genderless. This is also unusual. The vast majority of Pokemon have genders. Being genderless is a specific characteristic that, in the game's systems, affects certain moves and mechanics. It's not impossible for two Pokemon to share this characteristic, but the combination of shared weight and shared gender status is the beginning of a pattern. Mew and Ditto both know Transform. Ditto is famous for it. It is the only move Ditto can learn in the original games. But Mew can also learn Transform. In a roster of 151 Pokemon, only 2 know this specific move, and they are the 2 Pokemon sharing weight and gender characteristics. Mew and Ditto are both pink. Mew's shiny form is a slightly different shade of pink. Ditto's shiny form is blue. But in terms of base color, both creatures are pink. And finally, when you look at the game's internal structure and consider where Pokemon are found, Ditto is found in the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, the very location where, according to the mansion's journals, Mew was studied and Mewtwo was created from Mew's genetic material. The theory draws these threads together into a single proposal. Ditto is a failed clone of Mew. The logic of the theory goes like this. The Pokemon Mansion's journals document a Mew cloning project. The goal was to create a perfect clone, Mewtwo. But cloning, even in a world with the biological technology to make it work, is not a simple process. Failed attempts would be expected. And what would a failed Mew clone look like? If Mew's genetic material was successfully extracted, if its DNA could be read and partially replicated, but if the replication process broke down in some fundamental way, if the genetic instructions for Mew's full range of capabilities were corrupted or incomplete, you might produce a creature that could access the core function of Mew's genome, the ability to become any Pokemon, to transform into any form, but couldn't maintain any stable form of its own, a creature without a fixed identity, a creature whose entire existence is impersonation. Ditto. A failed Mew, the theory suggests, wouldn't be a Mewtwo-like enhanced version. It would be an incomplete version. Something that retained one of Mew's most fundamental characteristics. The ability to be anything, to transform into any creature, without retaining the rest. A mirror without a face. A copy function without original content. The weight match, the gender match, the transform match, the location. None of these are smoking guns individually, but together, they suggest that someone at Game Freak, consciously or unconsciously, designed a relationship between these 2 Pokemon that rewards very close attention. There is a counter theory, and it's worth considering because it reframes the Mew-Ditto relationship in a way that's equally interesting. The counter theory holds that Mew was not the original and Ditto the failed copy, but rather that in the game's development history, Ditto came first. Here's the argument. Ditto's move, Transform, was the template. A Pokemon that could become any other Pokemon was a useful development tool. You could test other Pokemon's animations and stats using a single Pokemon, rather than building full test implementations. Ditto, the theory suggests, was created as a technical utility Pokemon, and its data was simple and foundational because it was meant to be. Mew, added famously late in development, in the last 2 weeks before the cartridge data was finalized, squeezed into the game's memory by programmer Shigeki Morimoto, was built using Ditto's data as a starting template. The similarities between them exist because Mew was copied from Ditto, not because Ditto was failed from Mew. On this reading, the lore follows the development rather than the development reflecting an intended lore. The Pokemon Mansion connection is coincidental placement, or at most a knowing nod by the developers to the underlying technical reality. Ditto is where Mew came from, in code if not in story. And then there's Mewtwo, standing at the end of the story. Mewtwo's Pokédex entry in the original games is specific and haunting. It was created by a scientist after years of horrific gene splicing and DNA engineering experiments. The anime special that tells Mewtwo's origin story in more detail, Mewtwo Strikes Back, shows a creature born into consciousness in a laboratory, confused and in pain, gradually becoming aware of what it is and what was done to it and reacting with a rage that is, in context, entirely understandable. Mewtwo is the only successful clone of Mew. That only implies others. If Mewtwo is the only successful one, there were unsuccessful ones. Failed clones. Incomplete replications. Experiments that produce something but not Mewtwo. Ditto is in the Pokemon Mansion, a location defined by its role in the Mew cloning project, with the shared characteristics of its supposed source material, capable only of impersonating others. The theory holds. Whether it was intended or whether it emerged from the organic accumulation of design decisions, the story is there. Ditto is what you get when you try to clone something perfect and don't quite succeed. A mirror of Mew with all of the surface and none of the substance. And Mewtwo is what you get when you succeed too completely. Rest your eyes. Let your hands go slack. We're going somewhere that defies easy description. To the edges of the game world, where the code breaks and something looks back. Part 8. Missing no Amindong, the ghost in the machine. Let's talk about a Pokemon that should not exist. Not in the way that legendary Pokemon are rare and mythical and difficult to find. Those creatures, however extraordinary, are part of the game's intentional world. Mew was designed. Mewtwo was designed. Even the most obscure creature in the Pokédex has a number and a name and a set of stats that somebody decided on. There is an entry for them somewhere in the game's code, a place they're supposed to be. MissingNo has a place in the game's code too, but the place it occupies was never supposed to be visible. It was never supposed to be reachable. It exists in the space between the planned and the unplanned, in the structural gap between what the game intended to be and the reality of how it was actually built. And in that gap, something happened. Something assembled itself from the machinery of the game's inner workings and looked out at the player with a face made of corrupted pixels. And the player looked back, and a legend was born. To understand MissingNo, you need to understand a small piece of how the original Pokemon games manage their data. The game's Pokédex is numbered from 1 to 151. Those are the official Pokemon, the ones Game Freak designed and shipped. But the game's internal data structure doesn't cleanly stop at 151. The system that handles Pokemon data has slots, numbered positions in the game's memory, and not all of those slots are occupied by officially designed Pokemon. Some of them are empty but not blank. When the game's code needs to reference a Pokemon that doesn't exist, when the encounter system reaches into memory and finds a slot that has data in it, but no designed creature to correspond to, it produces what it can from what's there. Placeholder values. Random bits of memory that were never meant to form a coherent image or a coherent creature. The game assembles these fragments into something that technically meets the minimum requirements for a displayable entity and presents it to the player. The result is MissingNo. The name is itself a fragment, missing number, abbreviated, a label applied to a thing that exists only because there was nowhere else to put it. Its appearance in the original games is an L-shaped collection of visual static, a sprite built from the game's memory garbage, flickering at the edges. When you encounter it, the music behaves strangely. When you catch it, and you can catch it with a functioning Pokeball, it occupies a slot in your party where a Pokemon should be, but it doesn't fully belong there. It has a level. It has stats. It has a cry assembled from whatever audio data was adjacent to its memory location. It is, in the most technical sense, a Pokemon. It just wasn't meant to be one. The specific circumstances required to encounter MissingNo are part of what made it so strange and legendary to the children who first found it. You need to speak to the old man in Viridian City, the one who teaches you the catching tutorial at the start of the game. Specifically, you need to say no when he first offers to show you how to catch Pokemon. Wait until later in the game to trigger the tutorial, and then immediately fly to Cinnabar Island and surf along the eastern coastline. None of these steps have any obvious logical connection to each other. Speaking to an old man in a city in the northwest of the map, then flying to an island in the south, and surfing along a specific coast, why would these things be connected? Why would this sequence produce anything unusual at all? The answer involves the way the game temporarily stores your player name during the old man's tutorial. As explained earlier in our journey, the game swaps your name data with Old Man to make the tutorial function correctly. And when you trigger a wild encounter on Cinnabar's east coast, the game uses the values of your name's characters, their ASCII codes, to determine what you'll encounter. Certain character combinations produce high-level rare Pokemon. Others produce Missing No. The encounter is the game translating your name into a creature. Children who discovered this in the late 1990s without any of the technical context experienced it as something categorically different from a normal game discovery. This wasn't finding a hidden item or unlocking a secret area. This was the game doing something it visibly wasn't supposed to do, producing something visibly wrong, a presence in the world that felt less like a feature and more like a wound. The visual appearance of Missing No didn't help reassure anyone. It looked broken. It looked like the game had fractured and was showing you its inside. The raw, unfinished data that was supposed to stay invisible, now assembled into something that was watching you from across a patch of surf. Missing No's most famous effect, beyond its existence, is what happens to your inventory after you encounter it. The sixth item in your bag is duplicated. More precisely, the counter for the sixth item in your inventory overflows. The game represents item quantities as a single byte, a number from 0 to 255. When Missing No's encounter triggers a specific manipulation of that byte, the counter is pushed past its maximum and wraps around to an extremely high number. Effectively, you go from having, say, 3 rare candies in slot 6 to having 128 rare candies. Rare candies in the original Pokemon games instantly level up any Pokemon that consumes one. They are among the most valuable items in the game. Children who discovered this, who found that the terrifying broken glitch Pokemon in the surf also, incidentally, multiplied your most useful items, had a genuine philosophical puzzle on their hands. Was Missing No dangerous? Something suggested it might be, or at least that it was unstable. Encountering it too many times could corrupt your Hall of Fame data, leaving the records of your completed game permanently scrambled. Running from it or catching it seemed to produce different outcomes. Some players swore their games had been damaged by it. Was it good? The item multiplication was obviously useful. Some players deliberately sought Missing No out for precisely this reason. Not as an encounter with the uncanny, but as a resource to be exploited. The fact that it was both simultaneously, both a potential hazard and a potential tool, both an error and a discovery, is part of what made Missing No so culturally durable. It didn't have a simple meaning. It resisted categorization. Like the best monsters, it was interesting because it was ambiguous. What most players didn't know in the early years was that Missing No was not alone. The slot in the game's data structure that Missing No comes from is just one of many empty slots. Different character combinations in your player name trigger different entries from these empty regions, and those entries produce different glitch entities. Most of them are less stable than Missing No. More visually chaotic, more prone to crashing the game. Some of them have been named by the glitch research community, Emahumai, sometimes written just as M-Block, 3 Trainer Poke, and others. The entity known simply as M is particularly interesting and particularly dangerous. Unlike Missing No, which is relatively stable to encounter and catches without immediately breaking the game, M will frequently cause the game to freeze or crash if you try to interact with it in normal ways. Its sprite is more extreme in its visual corruption, less like a rough image and more like a field of noise. Its behavior in battle is erratic, and most significantly, if you manage to have M in your party under certain conditions, it can evolve. It evolves into Kangaskhan, a glitch entity whose existence is a consequence of your player name, encountered in a specific patch of surf on a specific island, will spontaneously become a completely legitimate Pokemon under the right conditions. The unintended can be transformed into the intended through the game's own evolutionary mechanics applied to something that was never supposed to participate in them. There is a version of this that, if you tilt your head and look at it from the right angle, feels almost like a metaphor. The incomplete thing, the fragment assembled from what's left over after everything else was made, can become whole. Not through any special intervention, not through a legendary bird's resurrection or a mad scientist's laboratory, but through the same simple process that turns a Caterpie into a Butterfree. It just grows. The broader Pokemon glitch research community, the small, dedicated group of players who have spent years examining the game's code, with tools and techniques that range from the playful to the genuinely technical, has produced a body of work about the glitch Pokemon of Generation 1 that is, by any measure, remarkable. They have documented dozens of distinct glitch entities, each with specific encounter conditions, specific behaviors, specific side effects. They have traced the exact memory addresses that each one occupies, explained precisely why each one looks and behaves as it does, and mapped the relationships between them. What this work reveals, cumulatively, is that the empty spaces in the original Pokemon games are not uniform. They are not all the same shade of nothing. Different parts of the game's unused data structure produce different effects, and those effects are consistent and reproducible. The glitch world has its own geography, its own ecology in a twisted sense. The creatures that live in the game's margins are not random. They are the specific product of the specific architecture of this specific game. Children of the decisions that were made about how to structure the data, about what numbers to use for what purposes, about where to put things in memory. Change any of those decisions, and you get different glitch entities. The ones that exist are the ones that these particular decisions produced. In that sense, MissingNo and its kin are as much a product of Game Freak's work as Pikachu is. They were not designed, but they were made. The same hands doing the same work with the same constraints and the same time pressures produced both the deliberate wonders and the accidental ones. The gap between Pikachu and MissingNo is smaller than it looks from the outside. Both are consequences of the same enormous act of creation. One was intended, one was not. Both are real. There is something that MissingNo represents in the cultural imagination that goes beyond gaming. It exists at the intersection of several ideas that are quietly powerful. The idea that behind every polished surface there is something unfinished. That the world you experience is an edited version of a more chaotic original. That the gaps in the map, the places you're not supposed to go, the data you're not supposed to see, are not empty, but rather full of something that the finished world had to push aside. Every system, if you push on it in exactly the right way, shows you its seams. Every map has edges. Every story has the things that were cut. And sometimes, when the seams come apart, what you find there is genuinely strange and genuinely interesting. Not because it was hidden by design, but because it was simply there, waiting, in the negative space of everything that was. MissingNo is the most famous example in gaming history of a glitch that became mythology. But the reason it became mythology is not really about the glitch itself. It's about what the glitch represents. The moment when the curtain moves and you see the machinery behind it, and the machinery, instead of being disappointing, turns out to be weirder and more wonderful than what was in front of it. Let your body be heavy. Let your breathing come slow and deep. We're going to visit the strangest corner of Pokemon's official lore now, a place where 26 letters hold the secret of creation itself. Part 9. The Unknown and Arceus, the alphabet at the end of the universe. There is a Pokemon called Unknown that is, by every conventional measure of the game's systems, the most useless creature in the series. It has one move. That move is called Hidden Power, and it deals normal type damage in most forms. Unknown's stats are uniformly mediocre. No particular strength, no area of excellence, no competitive application. There are 28 forms of Unknown, corresponding to the 26 letters of the English alphabet plus exclamation point and question mark. Collecting all 28 forms requires significant effort and is rewarded with nothing except the knowledge that you have collected them. No special event triggers, no legendary appears, no unique item is obtained. Mechanically, Unknown is a dead end, a curiosity. And yet, Unknown first appeared in Pokemon Gold and Silver, found in the ruins of Alph. A specific area in southern Johto that centers on ancient stone structures covered in carved, unknown-shaped symbols. The ruins contain puzzle chambers, and solving the puzzles produces new unknown forms and causes more of them to appear in the underground passages below. The ruins of Alph have an atmosphere entirely distinct from the rest of the game. Quieter, stranger, saturated with the sense of something very old that cannot quite be deciphered. The Pokédex entries for Unknown, spread across various games, hint at something enormous. In Gold and Silver, the entry notes that Unknown are shaped like ancient writing and were probably the first Pokemon in existence. Sapphire's entry says their flat, thin bodies resemble hieroglyphs on ancient walls, and researchers have been unable to determine which came first, the Pokemon or the writing. This is the first hint of the larger picture. Unknown are not just alphabetical Pokemon. They are, or maybe, letters in the language that reality is written in. The connection between Unknown and Arceus, the Pokemon that is, in the game's cosmology, the creator of the universe, is established most explicitly in a specific post-game event in Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Arceus is the alpha Pokemon. Its Pokédex entry, first appearing in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, states, "It is described in mythology as the Pokemon that shaped the universe with its 1,000 arms." Another entry in Pokemon Platinum says, "It is told in mythology that this Pokemon was born before the universe even existed. Arceus created the universe. It created the three beings of time, space, and antimatter, Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. It shaped the world, and it wrote everything down." In the Sinjoh Ruins, a location accessible only in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, when you have an event Arceus, there is a chamber called the Maestri Stage. Bringing Arceus here triggers one of the most extraordinary sequences in any Pokemon game. The creator of the universe appears, and in the ruins, surrounded by unknown symbols carved into every surface, Arceus reenacts the creation of either Dialga, Palkia, or Giratina for the player. The Sinjoh Ruins are not in Johto, they are not in Sinnoh. They exist in a place between these two regions, in a space that isn't quite mapped to either, accessible through the mountains. The architectural style of the ruins is a hybrid of Johto's Ruins of Alph and Sinnoh's Celestic Town ruins. Both sites of ancient unknown activity, both connected to creation mythology. The implication is that Unknown are present wherever the universe's fundamental operations are taking place. They are in the ruins where creation happened. They are on the walls of the Bashimon world's oldest structures. They are in the underground passages of Johto in their dozens of forms waiting to be found. The fan theory that emerges from all of this, and it is a theory that the games have never formally confirmed, but have also never done anything to discourage, is that Unknown are not simply a Pokemon. They are something more fundamental than that. The theory proposes that Unknown are the letters in the language Arceus used to write the universe. Creation in this framework was not a physical act but a linguistic one. Arceus wrote reality into being, and the characters it used to write it are the 28 forms of Unknown. The symbols carved on the walls of the oldest ruins aren't decorative. They're structural. They're the source code of existence, preserved in stone. This would explain why Unknown are in the ruins of Alph, a place named after the Alpha, the beginning. It would explain why they appear in the Sinjo ruins at the moment of creation. It would explain why their Pokédex entries tie them to the origins of all things and suggest they may predate every other Pokémon. It would also explain why Unknown, in the Pokémon movies, which tend to operate at a different register of cosmic power than the games, are portrayed as Wabite as immensely powerful reality warping entities. In Spell of the Unknown, the third Pokémon movie, a child's intense grief and desire activates the Unknown, who collectively reshape a portion of reality to match her imagination, encasing an entire town in crystal, summoning a legendary creature from fantasy, producing genuine miracles from pure focused intention. In the game, Unknown can barely damage a Caterpie. In the movie, Unknown can rewrite the physical world. The discrepancy is usually explained by the different power requirements of different media, the tendency of movies to inflate stakes for dramatic purposes. But if the Unknown as creation alphabet theory holds, there's a different explanation. The difference between a single Unknown encountered in a ruin and hundreds of Unknown acting in concert is the difference between a single letter and a complete sentence. One letter doesn't mean anything. Enough of them arranged correctly can say anything, can do anything. There is a detail in the Japanese version of Pokémon Crystal, the third game of the Gold and Silver generation, that never made it into the English localization, and which adds another layer to the Unknown mystery. In the Japanese Crystal, there is dialogue that can be triggered deep within the ruins of Alph that is not present in the English version. The dialogue is cryptic even in Japanese, and the translations that fans have produced disagree on some specifics, but the general content involves the Unknown communicating a warning or a message. Something to the effect that they are watching, that they have always been watching, that the world the player is standing in is a world they observe. Whether this was cut from the English version for localization reasons, because it was too strange, too difficult to translate cleanly, too cosmically unsettling for a game aimed at children, or for some other reason is not known. It exists now only in Japanese text, in a version of the game that most Western players never played, as a piece of lore that was almost universal and then wasn't. The Unknown Watch. And in the silence of the ruins, if you stop moving long enough, you can almost feel it. Arceus' own mystery deserves extended attention, because Arceus is a Pokémon whose relationship with the game's distribution systems made it for years essentially inaccessible. Arceus was first made available to players through a Nintendo event called the Azure Flute event in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. The Azure Flute was an item, a specific key item, that, when used at the Hall of Origin accessible from the top of Mount Coronet's Spear Pillar, would summon Arceus for a battle. The sequence was designed and programmed into the game. The Azure Flute exists in the game's code. The Hall of Origin exists. Arceus at level 80 with its full abilities and its status as the creator of the universe is accessible through this sequence. The event was never activated. Nintendo decided at some point during the lead-up to the game's international release not to distribute the Azure Flute. The reasons have never been officially explained. The event simply didn't happen. No Azure Flutes were distributed. The Hall of Origin sat at the top of the mountain, programmed, complete, and unreachable. Players with action replay cheat devices could give themselves the Azure Flute. Players who obtained Arceus through this method could trigger the Hall of Origin sequence and catch Arceus through the intended mechanism. But for anyone playing legitimately, without cheats, Arceus was unavailable through the Azure Flute for years. When Arceus was eventually made available, it was through a different distribution method, a mystery gift event that placed Arceus directly into the player's party without the Azure Flute or the Hall of Origin sequence. The Hall of Origin, with its Azure Flute sequence and its intended confrontation with the creator of the universe, has never been triggered by a legitimately obtained item in any official release. The most important event in the Pokemon world, the moment when you stand on the peak of the highest mountain and call down the creator of reality, was built fully and then quietly locked away. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some encounters should remain in theory. Maybe the gap between the possible and the actual is itself the thing worth thinking about. Breathe. Close your eyes a little more. We're going somewhere warm and nostalgic now, to the playgrounds and schoolyards where these myths were first told. Part 10. Playground Legends. The Myths Before the Internet. There was a time, and it was not very long ago in historical terms, when information about Pokemon traveled through a specific and beautiful medium, the mouths of children. In the late 1990s, the internet existed but was not yet the dominant information system it would become. Search engines were primitive. Wikis did not exist. The idea that you could type a question and receive a reliable, comprehensive answer from a global knowledge base was not yet real. If you wanted to know something about Pokemon, how to catch a specific creature, how to trigger a specific event, whether a specific rumor was true, you had to either own an official strategy guide, find a magazine that had covered the topic, or ask someone who claimed to know. And because the source material, the games themselves, was genuinely full of secrets, and because even the actual secrets were so strange and various that the line between plausible and impossible was blurry, and because children are both creative and enthusiastic transmitters of narrative. The myths that spread through Pokemon's early years were extraordinary in their specificity and creativity. This was the age of playground legends. And some of them were so durable, so widely believed, so deeply embedded in the cultural memory of an entire generation, that they deserve to be told properly, in the dark, at the end of a long day, with the same reverence we'd give to any folklore worth preserving. The most famous playground legend of all time, in the context of Pokemon, involves a truck. There is, in Pokemon Red and Blue, a truck. You can see it from the dock in Vermilion City, parked near the SS Anne. It is not normally accessible. To reach it, you need a specific sequence of actions involving Surf, which isn't normally available when you're in the part of the game that includes the SS Anne. The truck is simply there, visible but unreachable by ordinary means, and it serves no in-game function whatsoever. The legend held that if you could reach the truck through the strength HM, through some specific sequence of moves, through some mechanism that players pass between each other in whispered certainty, you could find Mew underneath it. The logic was almost self-reinforcing. Mew was the rarest Pokemon, legendarily difficult to obtain, not accessible through normal gameplay. The truck was a visible oddity, a thing that existed without obvious purpose. These two mysteries clearly belonged together. The truck existed to hide Mew. Mew existed beneath the truck. Anyone who told you otherwise either hadn't found the right sequence or was lying because they wanted to keep it secret. Mew is not under the truck. There is nothing under the truck. The truck is a texture on the dock environment with no special properties. The only method of reaching it requires specific glitch execution, and doing so produces nothing except the truck, which is exactly what it appeared to be from a distance: a truck. But here's the thing. In Pokemon Sun and Moon, released in 2016, there is a truck. It is parked near the harbor. It serves no in-game function. And if you talk to the player character near it, there is dialogue that is a direct, affectionate, knowing nod to the 30 years of mythology surrounding an unremarkable vehicle in Vermilion City. Game Freak remembered. Of course they remembered. An entire generation of children believed with genuine conviction that the secret of the rarest Pokemon was hidden under a truck. The developers knew. And 20 years later, they put a truck in their game, right by the harbor, as a monument to the belief. The myth was wrong about the facts, but it was right about the spirit of the thing. Mew was somewhere hidden. Somewhere reachable if you knew the right thing to do. The truck was the wrong location, but the right instinct. There is a name that circulated through schoolyards in 1999, 2000, 2001, that has achieved a specific kind of immortality. Pika-Blue. Pika-Blue was, the legend held, a secret Pokemon. A blue. An evolved or alternative form of Pikachu? Or perhaps a completely distinct creature with similar characteristics. Pika-Blue could be obtained through some specific and difficult mechanism. Players who had traveled to Japan claimed to have seen it. Someone's older brother's friend had one. There were grainy photographs, and this is the part that, in retrospect, is genuinely amazing. Photographs allegedly showing Pika-Blue on someone's Game Boy screen, passed from hand to hand, studied carefully, debated seriously. Pika-Blue was Marill. Marill is a small, round blue Pokemon, a water type, with large round ears, white-tipped tail, a spherical body. It appeared in a Pokemon anime movie short before the Gold and Silver games launched, as a teaser for the upcoming generation. Children who saw this short saw a small blue round creature that looked vaguely Pikachu adjacent, and immediately began asking questions. The name Pika-Blue emerged from this. It was not a name anyone at Game Freak or Nintendo ever used. It was invented spontaneously by children who saw the creature and applied the logic of Pokemon naming to it. Pikachu is electric and yellow. This one is blue. It might be called Pika-Blue. Marill's actual name was not known to Western audiences at the time. So Pika-Blue it was, in schoolyards across the world until Gold and Silver launched, and the official name became known. But here's what's quietly wonderful about the Pika-Blue story. The children who named it weren't wrong in any meaningful sense. They saw a new creature. They didn't know its name. They gave it one that followed the same logic as the names they already knew. It's exactly what humans do with nameless things. It's what we've always done. The name was wrong. The instinct was absolutely right. The Pokegods were the apex of playground mythology. In the years between the release of Red and Blue and the release of Gold and Silver, when the original games had been thoroughly explored and the prospect of new Pokemon was still a distant rumor, a specific genre of legend emerged. The God-tier Pokemon. Creatures of extraordinary power, hidden behind impenetrable barriers of in-game achievement. Accessible only through combinations of luck and knowledge so extreme that only the most committed players could even attempt them. These were the Pokegods. The most famous was Pika-Blue, as we've discussed, but Pika-Blue was merely the most plausible. The roster of Pokegods claimed by various playground sources included creatures named Charizardite, Mewtwo, an attempt at the Japanese name for Mewtwo being misapplied to a new creature, Flareth, Raybolt, Totodile, actually a Generation 2 starter, but circulating as a rumor before the games launched, and dozens of others with names assembled from the same combinatory logic as Pika-Blue. The methods required to unlock Pokegods were baroque in their complexity. Walk exactly 10,000 steps in a specific area. Talk to a specific NPC in a specific order. Have a full party of level 100 Pokemon with no Pokemon in your PC. Stand on a specific tile for a specific number of seconds. These instructions were passed between children with complete sincerity, received and followed with complete sincerity. And when they inevitably didn't work, the failure was attributed not to the instructions being false, but to some small error in their execution. You must have been one step off. You must have talked to the NPC in the wrong order. Try again. The internet killed the Pokegods. Not quickly, not all at once, but gradually as the web became the dominant information source for gaming. As Game FAQs and Bulbapedia and Cerebi established comprehensive, verified, citation-supported records of what was and wasn't in the games, the space for unverified legend contracted. You could just look it up. You could see the game's data extracted and displayed and know for certain what was there and what wasn't. The certainty was good, and it was necessary, but there was something lost too. The Pokegods were, in their way, a tribute to the games. They were children's intuition that something this rich and strange and full of real secrets must contain more real secrets than anyone had found yet. They were the imagination running ahead of the evidence, filling the space with things that felt like they should be there. Pokemon was big enough that even its myths had myths. The last playground legend we'll visit tonight is the most specific and, in some ways, the most interesting, because unlike the others, it remains genuinely unresolved. The pre-release Raichu card. In the early days of the Pokemon trading card game, before Wizards of the Coast had fully established their production processes for the Western market, there was a period when test prints and promotional materials were produced in limited quantities for internal use and for specific events. These test prints sometimes went astray. They ended up in places they weren't supposed to be. The legend of the pre-release Raichu holds that during this period, a small number of Raichu cards were produced bearing a stamp that read, pre-release. A stamp that was supposed to be applied to a promotional set of cards, but was applied to the wrong card through some production error. These cards allegedly exist in tiny numbers, a handful at most, perhaps fewer than 10 in the world, and are extraordinarily valuable. The reason this legend is different from the Truck and from Pikablue is that it is at least partially documented. People have claimed to own pre-release Raichu cards. Photographs exist. Discussion forums from the early Pokemon trading card collecting community contain threads debating their authenticity with considerable technical detail. Examining the font of the pre-release stamp, the print quality of the card, the specific characteristics that would identify a genuine production error versus a forgery. Wizards of the Coast, when asked, gave inconsistent statements over the years. Some employees said they had no knowledge of such a card. Others gave responses that were ambiguous enough to fuel rather than resolve the debate. The pre-release Raichu card remains, more than 25 years after the trading card game launched, an unverified but also undisproved legend. Cards claimed to be genuine have sold, or been offered for sale at extraordinary prices. The collecting community remains divided on their authenticity. This is a genuinely open question. Unlike the Truck or Pikablue, the pre-release Raichu sits in a space where the truth is simply not known, where the evidence is fragmentary and the original manufacturer is either unable or unwilling to provide a definitive answer. It might be real. The most famous playground legend in Pokemon card collecting history might be a true account of a real production error that produced a small number of genuinely extraordinary objects. Or it might be an extraordinarily successful hoax that has persisted for decades because the Pokemon community has always been especially receptive to mystery. No one knows. That somehow feels right. Let your body sink deeper into wherever it is that you're resting. We're in the final stretch now, and it's the darkest part of the night before the quiet comes. Part 11. What the Pokédex hides. The dark lore written in plain sight. The Pokédex entries are supposed to be straightforward. That's how they present themselves. Short, factual descriptions of Pokémon. their physical characteristics, their habits, their diets, their habitats. Written in the dry clinical voice of a scientific reference document. The kind of thing you'd scan quickly, note the interesting detail, and move on. But if you read them carefully, if you read all of them, across all the games, and sit with what they're actually saying, a different picture emerges. One that is quieter and stranger, and in specific cases, genuinely disturbing. Game Freak has been hiding things in the Pokédex for decades. Not secrets in the mechanical sense, not glitches or exploits, but ideas. Dark ones. Ideas about death and grief and loss, and the specific horrors that live just beneath the surface of a world that is, in most of its presentation, cheerful and colorful and warm. Let's visit some of them tonight, slowly, with the care they deserve. Begin with Drifloon. Drifloon is a ghost/flying type Pokemon that looks at first glance genuinely charming. A small, round purple balloon with a yellow heart-shaped body and a fluffy white tuft at the top, like the string of a balloon that has been tied in a cloud shape. It bobs gently. It looks like a toy. It looks like something you'd find at a birthday party. The Pokédex entry for Drifloon in Diamond and Pearl reads, in part, "It tugs on the hands of children to steal them away. However, it gets pulled around instead." It tugs on the hands of children to steal them away. This balloon, this thing that looks like a toy, this round, cheerful birthday party object, is specifically attempting to abduct children. It grabs their hands and tries to carry them off. The only reason it fails is that it is not strong enough. The child's weight causes the balloon to be dragged around rather than lifting the child off the ground. The implication, which the entry is kind enough not to spell out fully, is that a sufficiently large group of Drifloon, or a sufficiently light child, would be a problem. And this is in the National Pokédex of a game rated E for everyone. In subsequent games, the entry is extended and clarified in ways that do not make it better. Drifloon's evolved form, Drifblim, has entries noting that on nights when it appears, it silently grabs hold of people and carries them off into the sky. No one knows where they go. The destination of Drifblim's passengers is not recorded. Drifloon was the first major signal for many players that the Pokédex contained things worth reading carefully. That behind the dry scientific language was sometimes something that the game's overall presentation was for reasons of genre and audience, choosing not to foreground. Then there is Yamask. Yamask is a ghost-type Pokemon introduced in black and white. It has a human-shaped body, a vaguely mummy-like silhouette with a dark, wispy form, and it carries a golden mask in one hand. The mask has a face on it. A human face. The Pokédex entry reads, "Each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. Sometimes they look at it and cry. When it was human." Yamask was a person, a human being who died and became this ghost Pokemon. And the mask it carries is not a memento, not a symbol. It is its own former face, the face it had when it was alive. And sometimes, Yamask looks at its old face and grieves. The implications of this entry reach into the game's cosmology in ways that the games never fully explore and never need to, because the single Pokédex entry does all the work. If Yamask was human, what does that mean for other ghost types? What does it mean for Gengar? Gengar's entries in various games describe it as a shadow of a person, as something that was human, as a creature that lures people to their deaths out of loneliness. The shadow of a person with a human-shaped silhouette with human-shaped loneliness. The Pokemon world contains, somewhere between its cheerful towns and its friendly trainers, the echoes of human dead. They wander. They carry their own faces and weep at what they once were. They try to lure the living after them, because they remember what it was to be alive and they miss it. This is in a game where your 10-year-old protagonist walks the world alone, befriending everything they meet. Phantump grows in forests. Grows in Its Pokédex entry in X and Y states, these Pokémon are created when spirits possess rotten tree stumps. Rumor has it that the stumps are possessed by the spirits of children who died while lost in the forest. Children who died while lost in the forest. The small, round, stump-like Pokémon with twigs growing from its head and sad, small eyes is the spirit of a dead child. That's what the entry says. Not it is believed to be in a way that implies the belief might be wrong. Rumor has it, yes, which technically leaves room for doubt, but the game never contradicts this rumor, never provides an alternative explanation, and the design of Phantump, small, tree-shaped, suggestive of something organic that has been stopped in growth, reinforces rather than undermines the reading. The forests of Kalos, where you catch Phantump, are full of children who didn't make it home. Mimikyu lives inside a disguise. Its costume is made from an old piece of cloth that has been modified to look like Pikachu. The reason for this is given in its Pokédex entries. Mimikyu is a ghost/fairy type that is shy and lonely and wants desperately to be loved. It is observed that Pikachu is beloved by humans, and it has constructed a costume in Pikachu's shape in hopes that if it looks enough like the thing people love, people will love it too. This is sad in the way that much loneliness is sad. Recognizable and quiet and a little bit painful to sit with. But then there's the other detail. Mimikyu's true form beneath the costume has never been seen. Those who have glimpsed it through the gaps in the costume have experienced intense fear or illness. A researcher who attempted to study it directly became terrifyingly ill and spent several days in the hospital. The entry notes that Mimikyu desperately wants no one to ever see what it actually looks like, and if the costume is damaged, Mimikyu will work frantically to repair it under cover of darkness, not wanting anyone to glimpse its true form in the process. There is a creature that looks, on the surface, like a sad story about loneliness and the desire to be loved. And that story is real. Mimikyu genuinely wants to be loved, genuinely crafted its disguise out of that longing. But underneath the longing, underneath the costume, there is something that is simply forbidden to be seen. Something that the game will not show you and will not describe. Only note that seeing it causes illness and fear. The loneliness and the horror exist simultaneously. The thing that wants love is also the thing that cannot be safely perceived. That's not a comfortable combination of ideas. Shedinja is perhaps the most philosophically unsettling Pokémon in the entire series, and it earns that distinction without any particular drama or shock value. Shedinja is the shed skin of Nincada as it evolves into Ninjask. When Nincada evolves, it leaves behind its shed exoskeleton, and that shed skin becomes a separate Pokémon. Shedinja has exactly one hit point. It cannot survive a single successful hit from most attacks. It floats motionlessly. It doesn't breathe. Its entry states that it doesn't move, that it doesn't blink, that examining it gives you the feeling that your soul is being sucked in through the hole in its back, and that you should never look into that hole. This entry appears in games rated E for everyone. Never look into the hole in the Pokémon's back because looking into it will pull your soul out of your body. Shedinja is the empty shell of a living creature, now animated by nothing, existing on the absolute minimum margin of vitality, carrying a hole in its back that threatens the souls of those who look at it. It has, the entries suggest, already lost whatever made it alive. What remains is presence without content. The shape of something after the something is gone. There's one more dark entry we'll visit tonight because it closes a circle that we opened hours ago when we talked about Cubone. Cubone is the lonely Pokémon. Its skull helmet is the skull of its dead mother. Its cries sound like a child weeping. The entire design concept of Cubone is loss. Specifically the loss of a parent. Specifically the loss that leaves a child alone in the world, wearing the bones of the person who loved them most. The fan theory, never confirmed but never denied, holds that Cubone and Kangaskhan are more deeply connected than their surface presentation suggests. Kangaskhan is a Pokemon that carries its child in a pouch. It is fiercely maternal, famously protective. Its most notable characteristic is this permanent physical bond between parent and young. It doesn't leave its child. It cannot. The theory, Kangaskhan's child, if separated from its parent by the parent's death, would survive alone and in grief. It would wear its mother's skull because it has nothing else left of her. It would grow up in isolation. Its mourning so fundamental to its identity that evolution would change its shape rather than resolve its grief. Cubone would evolve into Marowak, still alone, still carrying the skull, still grieving. And the Marowak ghost in Pokemon Tower, the one that cannot rest because she was killed by Team Rocket, the one whose murder is the crime at the center of Lavender Town's tragedy, might have been a Kangaskhan who died before her child was old enough to stand on its own. Game Freak has never confirmed this. The theory has never been made canonical. But it is not, in any way, contradicted by anything in the games, and it fits with perfect tragic logic. The ghost of the mother haunts the tower. The child wanders Kanto alone, wearing her face. Breathe. Just breathe. Let the silence of the room hold you for a moment before we reach the end. Part 12. The Fields That Were. Closing Reflections. We have traveled a long way tonight. From a boy in a field in Machida, watching beetles push through grass, we have moved through 6 years of near failure and the extraordinary act of will that produced a game. We have explored the bugs and glitches and hidden truths in the original code, the artifacts of constraint and exhaustion that became somehow legend. We have stood in the graveyard of Lavender Town and listened to music that says something true about impermanence. We have looked at the ruins of a war that was never spoken aloud. We have watched episodes that couldn't be shown and caught Pokemon that weren't supposed to exist and followed a cable through impossible mathematical space to find the rarest creature in the game hiding in a perfectly ordinary patch of surf. We found the Pokemon that were designed and then discarded, preserved now in leaked data, loved by people who will never be able to catch them in any official game. We stood at the triangle of Mew and Ditto and Mewtwo and understood, maybe, the story of what happens when you try to copy something perfect. We looked into the empty face of MissingNo and recognized in it something that lives in every creative act. The negative space, the structural remainder, the thing that assembles itself from what's left over when the intended world is complete. We sat with the unknown in their ruins and contemplated the idea that the universe is written in 28 characters, that creation is a linguistic act, that the letters carved on the oldest walls are not symbols of something. They are the something. We walked the playgrounds where myths were born, where children who could not look up the answer simply made one up, where the collective imagination filled the spaces that the actual game left open, and produced in doing so a folklore as rich and specific and durable as any that came before it. And we read the Pokédex carefully. We noticed the balloon that steals children, the mask that used to be a face, the forest stumps that contain the spirits of the lost, the shell with the hole in its back, and the warning, "Do not look in." We noticed that the same world that taught us to love our partners and to fight for our dreams also quietly, consistently, described a world full of grief and loss, and the specific kinds of horror that come from loving things that do not last. All of this was built by a man who lost a field. That is still, after everything we've covered tonight, the thing that gets me most. The origin story of Pokemon is, at its core, a story about conservation, about the impulse to preserve something beautiful that is being destroyed, and about the specific human solution of building it somewhere that cannot be paved over. Satoshi Tajiri could not stop the development of Machida. He could not restore the fields and rivers and forests of his childhood. He could not give back to any child the specific experience of crouching in long grass, listening for something moving, the whole world narrowed to this one small patch of living earth and the creature in it. But he could build a game where children could go to long grass and find creatures there. He could build a world where the hunt and the finding and the careful attention to living things was the entire point. He could fill the cable that connects two small machines with something that moved through it the way insects moved through the fields he loved, quietly, purposefully, with the specific joy of things that are alive and going somewhere. He made fields, digital ones in every sense of the word, fields that could not be destroyed, fields that expanded with every new generation, new Pokemon added to the tall grass, new mysteries buried in the code, new dark entries tucked into the Pokedex alongside the cheerful ones. Because he understood, consciously or not, that real fields are not only beautiful, they are also full of things that live by eating other things. They are full of death and predation and the particular melancholy of autumn. They are full of the bones of things that didn't make it. Real nature is not only wonder, it is also loss. And Pokemon, more than almost any other piece of entertainment ever made for children, understands this. There is a line that gets me every time I think about it, in the context of everything we've discussed tonight. The Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, Pokemon die, their trainers grieve. There is a graveyard in the middle of the map. In a game about collecting and competing and winning badges, the developers built a graveyard. They put it in the center of the region. They surrounded it with ghost Pokemon. They wrote the inscriptions on the tombstones. They composed a piece of music that sounds like the precise note between comfort and sorrow. That sounds like what you feel when you miss something irreplaceable. That sounds like the fields at Machida, maybe. On an evening before the concrete came. They didn't have to do any of that. The game would have functioned perfectly without it. The graveyard serves no mechanical purpose that couldn't have been served by something less quietly devastating. They built it anyway, because the game was always also about what it means to love something you might lose. And every child who sat with the Pokemon Tower music, who raid the grave markers, who caught the ghost Pokemon between the headstones, and thought something unspecific inside, every one of them was receiving something that Satoshi Tajiri put there on purpose. Not explicitly, not with a labeled message, not in a way you could point to and say, this is the lesson. Just there, in the middle of the adventure, a quiet reminder. Things pass. That's why they matter. The sun will come up wherever you are eventually. The questions we've traveled through tonight, the real ones and the invented ones, the glitches and the theories and the myths and the dark truths in the Pokédex, none of them need to be resolved before morning. That's not why we visit them. We visit them because mystery is pleasurable in its own right. Because there is a specific, gentle satisfaction in sitting with questions that don't have clean answers, in tracing the edges of something large and strange and human without needing to reduce it to a simple point. Pokemon is 30 years old now and still going, still producing new games and new creatures and new stories for new children, still putting tall grass between every pair of towns so that the children who walk through it will find something living in there and feel, for a moment, the specific joy of discovery, still building fields. The boy from Machida built 100 million fields. And somewhere in each of them, if you look carefully enough, if you push into the tall grass with genuine curiosity and genuine attention, there is something waiting. Something that was always there. Something worth finding. If this was the kind of company you wanted to keep tonight, If these stories and mysteries gave you something to rest your mind on, something quiet and interesting to float in as the night goes on, then I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel and coming back. Every new video is more of this: the strange, the hidden, the lovingly researched, the gently told. There is so much more we haven't covered. So many mysteries still waiting. Until next time, stay curious, stay gentle with yourself, and sleep well. Wherever you are, whatever field of stars is above you tonight, you found something good here. And that matters. End of script. Part 13, The Hidden Architecture of Johto. What gold and silver almost were. Let's slow down and linger in Johto for a while, because gold and silver deserve more than a passing mention. These games are, by the consensus of a large portion of the Pokemon fandom, the high water mark of the franchise, the moment when everything the original games established was refined and deepened and made more beautiful without losing any of the original's rough-edged honesty. They were released in Japan in November 1999 and internationally in 2000 and 2001. And they arrived carrying an extraordinary number of changes that have since become so standard that it's almost impossible to remember they didn't always exist. The day and night cycle, the 2-region map, breeding, the friendship mechanic, the Pokegear, the bug-catching contest. The Safari Zone returned and expanded. 2 rivals with completely different relationships to the protagonist. A post-game that was genuinely an entire second adventure. All of these things feel inevitable now. They feel like they were always going to be there, like the games could not have been built any other way. But every one of them was a decision. A specific, contested decision made during a development process that nearly discarded some of them entirely. Start with the day and night cycle. The decision to make Pokemon Gold and Silver operate in real time, to have the game read the internal clock of the Game Boy Color, and change the game's visual appearance and Pokemon availability and NPC dialogue based on what time it actually was in the real world, was described by developers as one of the most technically and philosophically contested decisions in the game's production. The Game Boy Color's hardware was constrained in ways that made real-time palettes expensive. Displaying different colors for day, evening, and night required storing multiple color palettes for each map tile. And the total memory cost of doing this comprehensively was significant. There was genuine concern that the feature would need to be cut, that the memory simply wasn't there, that the hardware couldn't support it at a quality that would feel satisfying rather than compromised. The solution involved compression techniques and creative memory management that pushed the hardware close to its limits. The team kept the feature because they understood that it was not merely a visual novelty. The day and night cycle changed the fundamental relationship between the player and the game world. A game that responds to the actual time you're playing, it is a different kind of game from one that doesn't. It creates a connection between your real life and the fictional world. Your morning walk in the game corresponds to a morning in Johto. Your late-night play session puts you in a Johto that is also dark and quiet. This is the design philosophy that would, years later, animate Animal Crossing into becoming one of Nintendo's most beloved franchises. The game that knows what time it is occupies a different place in your life from the game that doesn't. Gold and Silver understood this, and the developers fought to keep the feature because they knew intuitively that it would change everything about how the games felt to live with. The real-time clock also enabled events that could only happen at specific times. The bug-catching contest on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. The Pokemon that appeared only at night. The specific daily items that reset each morning. Johto became a world with a schedule. With rhythms. With the particular texture of a place that is alive and ongoing, rather than frozen in a permanent present tense. The friendship mechanic introduced in Gold and Silver, the hidden numerical value attached to each Pokemon that rises through positive interactions and falls through negative ones. and which determines whether certain evolutions happen and whether certain moves land with bonus effect, was nearly invisible by design. This was intentional. The developers wanted to reward players who were naturally kind to their Pokemon, who fed them, who kept them from fainting, who used items on them, without explicitly telling those players that their kindness had a mechanical reward. The friendship system was meant to be discovered rather than documented. If you were the kind of player who genuinely cared about your team, you would get Espeon or Umbreon. If you were the kind of player who primarily viewed your Pokemon as combat tools, you might find those evolutions mysteriously unavailable. The game was watching how you played. It was, in the quietest possible way, evaluating whether you were being a good partner to your Pokemon. In Gold and Silver, your starter Pokemon's happiness at the beginning of the game is set at a specific value that represents an existing relationship. The implication being that the Pokemon you begin with is not a stranger, but a creature you've already connected with. The opening moments of the game are not the beginning of the relationship. They're a reunion. The friendship mechanic also produced one of the game's most quietly affecting interactions. If you check on a Pokemon that is unhappy, one you've been neglecting or allowing to faint repeatedly, the game notes that it doesn't seem to trust you yet, or that it seems to be a little wary. These descriptions don't do anything mechanically. They're just true, and they're said, and then the interaction ends. A game telling you that your Pokemon doesn't trust you is a different kind of feedback from most video games. It's not a penalty in the conventional sense. It's a relationship status update delivered with complete emotional neutrality. Whether you feel anything in response to it is entirely up to you. The breeding mechanic introduced in Gold and Silver fundamentally changed the relationship between players and the series' deeper mechanics in ways that are still being explored and refined 30 years later. Before breeding, every Pokemon you used was essentially fixed at the moment you caught or received it. You could train it, evolve it, teach it moves, but the underlying values that determined its statistical potential were immutable. Whatever it was when you found it, it would always be. Breeding introduced inheritance. Baby Pokemon inherited characteristics from their parents. Move pools passed down. Pools. Certain competitive values, the individual values, the IVEs, that determined each Pokemon's maximum potential in each stat, had a chance of coming from either parent. For the average player, this was simply the mechanic that let you get baby versions of some Pokemon and produce eggs to trade. But for competitive players, it was the beginning of an entire additional game. A breeding puzzle, a genetic optimization problem, a way of pursuing the theoretically perfect Pokemon through generations of careful selection. The competitive scene around Pokemon, which existed informally from the very beginning, in link cable battles between children who had developed their own meta strategies, and which has since evolved into a full professional ecosystem, with official tournament circuits and dedicated game formats, owes its depth almost entirely to the combination of IVs, EVs, breeding, and natures that was, established in Generation 2 and refined in every generation since. But here's the thing about Gold and Silver's competitive design that is most interesting from a historical standpoint. The developers did not fully anticipate what they were creating. The IV system existed in Generation 1. The EV system, then called Stat Experience, also existed in a different and less precise form. These systems were functional, but were never documented or explained to players. They were simply there, operating invisibly, and players who noticed their effects at all chalked them up to random variation. Gold and Silver refined these systems and added breeding, and the combination of the three created something the developers described in later interviews as being more complex than they'd quite intended. The competitive depth that emerged was real and was good, and has sustained a competitive scene for 30 years. But it was not the result of a fully deliberate design for competitive depth, so much as the natural consequence of several design decisions that interacted in ways that nobody had completely mapped out in advance. The game is wiser than its makers knew. Before we leave Johto entirely, there is one more thing worth lingering on, and it is one of the most quietly extraordinary decisions in Pokemon's history. The map. Pokemon Gold and Silver include not just Johto, but Kanto. After you have completed the main story, defeated the Elite Four, become champion, seen the credits roll, watched the save screen return, the game opens a new section of the world. A train from Goldenrod City carries you east, and you step off onto the outskirts of Vermilion City, Kanto, the original. The whole region from the first games, rebuilt for the Game Boy Color, compressed but complete, with its 8 gym leaders and its familiar towns and all the things you first learned to navigate 5 years earlier. You are not revisiting the first game. The events of the first game are over. Years have passed in the game's internal chronology. Perhaps 3 years, the number that is most commonly cited, though the games are coy about specifics. The gym leaders have had time to grow. Some of them have changed significantly. Misty is more serious. Brock is exactly as you'd expect. Janine has taken over the Fuchsia Gym from her father Koga, who has moved up to the Elite Four. Kanto. Without Red and Blue's story is Kanto after the story. It is a familiar world from an unfamiliar angle. Not the stage of an adventure, but the setting of what came after the adventure was over. The people you knew are still there, still living their lives. The world went on. And at the very end, at the peak of Mount Silver, in the highest accessible point in the entire combined world of Kanto and Johto, there is a trainer who does not speak. He is called Red. He is your player character from the first games. 3 years later, older, standing alone at the summit of the world's highest mountain with no explanation for why he is there. And when you challenge him, he is the hardest opponent in either game, with a team built from the most iconic and powerful Pokemon of the first generation, trained to the highest levels the games can contain. He doesn't say anything, because he is a player character, Kiwiita. He was your avatar, your silent proxy, the figure through whom you experienced the original adventure. He cannot speak because he was never given a voice. He can only stand and fight. The encounter at the peak of Mount Silver is one of the most emotionally charged moments in the franchise's history, and it achieves that charge almost entirely through restraint. No dialogue, no dramatic music swell beyond the battle theme. Just the summit and the snow and a figure standing with his back to you who was once you, now becomes something else. Something legendary. Part 14. The Competitive Underground. How players built a meta. There's a game within the game that most casual players never see, and it has been running quietly in parallel with the official Pokemon experience since almost the very beginning. It is called the competitive meta, and it is the result of millions of players over 30 years, collectively discovering the full depth of a system that was built with more complexity than any single player was expected to fully explore. The meta begins, as all metagames do, with a simple observation. Not all Pokemon are equal, and not all strategies are equal, and if you want to win against serious opponents, you need to understand the difference. The first generation's competitive landscape, in the years before it was well documented, was dominated by a handful of insights that players discovered independently and then shared. The speed stat determined which Pokemon moved first, and moving first in a game with guaranteed kill moves at high levels was often decisive. Certain moves were drastically more powerful than their nominal descriptions suggested when combined with specific type matchups and the game's damage calculation quirks. The sleep mechanic in Generation 1 was so powerful, allowing the sleeping Pokemon to be attacked freely for an essentially unlimited number of turns, that it warped the entire competitive environment around it. These discoveries didn't come from Nintendo. They came from players who played seriously and paid attention and talked to each other about what they noticed. The earliest competitive community for Pokemon gathered in places that are, by modern standards, charmingly primitive. Email lists, early web forums, Usenet groups. Players would describe strategies and test each other's knowledge and argue about edge cases with the specific, joyful earnestness of people who are discovering a new intellectual territory in real time. What they were discovering was that the simple children's game about catching and trading and being friendly had underneath its accessible surface a system of genuine strategic depth. Not the kind of depth you encounter immediately, not the kind that gets in the way of casual enjoyment, but the kind that rewards sustained, serious attention. The kind that has supported professional competitive scenes for 30 years, because it never quite runs out of things to think about. The introduction of natures in Generation 3, a characteristic that boosted one stat by 10% and reduced another by 10%, added a dimension of personality to breeding that made every Pokemon feel more specific, more individual. The move Earthquake and its interactions with levitation and flying and specific abilities created entire strategic landscapes. The introduction of held items, of weather conditions that could be set and maintained, of abilities that triggered passively and interactively. Each generation added more pieces to a puzzle that was, somehow, never complete. The players who mastered the system were doing something genuinely complex. They were analyzing probability and type matchups and specific numerical interactions and the psychology of their opponents simultaneously across 6-on-6 team compositions that required predicting what the opponent had brought and what they were planning and how to position against plans that hadn't yet been revealed. This is the game that happens invisibly, parallel to the one being played by children on the way to school. Both are real Pokemon. The Smogon University website, named, with appropriate irony, after a Pokemon that is essentially a floating ball of toxic gas, became, in the early 2000s, the central intellectual institution of the competitive Pokemon community. It is where strategies are debated, where tier lists are maintained, where the competitive rules and formats that govern unofficial but widely used competitive play are determined and updated. Smogon operates on the principle that the official tournament formats, the video game championships run by the Pokemon Company, are not the only valid competitive framework, and that a different set of rules and battle formats can produce more interesting and more complex strategic play. The debate between Smogon competitive formats and VGC competitive formats has been ongoing for nearly 2 decades and shows no signs of resolution. Because both communities are correct that their preferred format has specific qualities the other lacks. What Smogon represents, culturally, is the players taking ownership of the game's competitive implications and building a structure around them that the official creators never quite provided. It is the community becoming the authority on a specific dimension of the game, because the community has put in the work. This is, in a small way, the same thing that happened with the playground myths of the 1990s. Players looking at a game that was too rich to fully explore officially and deciding, collectively, to explore it themselves. Building the maps the developers didn't build. Documenting the territories the official guides didn't cover. Doing the work that the game seemed to invite but couldn't contain. The Elite Four are, in the official games, the final major obstacle between the player and the champion. They are 4 trainers of exceptional skill, each specializing in a type guarded by mechanics, no Pokemon centers between them, the need to defeat all 4 consecutively that make them a genuine challenge. But the Elite Four's most interesting competitive legacy is as a model. The concept of a small group of exceptional trainers who have achieved a specific kind of mastery and who represent the ceiling of official competitive achievement. This structure has been replicated in fan tournaments, online leagues, competitive communities, and unofficial challenge circuits ever since the games introduced it. The Elite Four model maps naturally onto competitive organizations because it is, at its core, a ladder with clear rungs and a final test that determines whether you have truly arrived. The competitive community built its own Elite Fours. Not official ones, not recognized by Nintendo or Game Freak, but self-organizing communities with their own tier lists and their own gauntlets and their own champions. And those champions earned their titles through the same combination of preparation and adaptability and deep knowledge that the games were always modeling, however distantly, with their 8-gym progression toward the Final Four. The structure of the games taught the players how to build communities. The players then built them. Part 15. Sound, silence, and what the music actually does. There is a dimension of Pokemon that is easy to take for granted because it is so omnipresent and so familiar. That is the music. Every town and every game has a theme. Every battle has a theme. Every Pokemon has a cry. The accumulated sonic world of Pokemon is one of the most extensive and varied in gaming. And it was built generation by generation by a small number of composers working under significant hardware constraints who produce music that is, by any fair measure, genuinely extraordinary. Junichi Masuda composed the vast majority of the original Red and Blue soundtrack, and the constraints he worked under are worth understanding. The Game Boy's sound chip, the Sharp LR35902's audio processing unit, could produce 4 channels of audio simultaneously. 2 square wave channels for melody lines, 1 wave channel for bass or melody, and 1 noise channel for percussion. 4 channels! That's it! Every piece of music in the original Pokemon games was written for 4 channels of audio on a Game Boy sound chip. The warmth and character and memorability of the Pallet Town theme, the Victory Fanfare, the Battle theme, the Gym Leader theme, the Wild Encounter theme, all of it was made with 4 channels and the composer's intelligence and care. What Masuda understood, and what is evident in the original Pokemon music, is that constraint can produce a specific kind of clarity. When you have 4 channels, you cannot rely on texture or density to create effect. You have to create effect through melody, through rhythm, through the specific intervals between notes, and the specific ways those intervals make you feel. The music has to work on its own terms, as music, without the support of lush orchestration or complex harmonic layers. The Pokemon battle theme in Red and Blue is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in the history of gaming, and it works because of its melody. Strip away the 4-channel production, play it on a single instrument, and it still works. It has shape and energy and a specific triumphant quality that communicates something precise. You are in a contest, and you might win it, and winning it would feel good. The Lavender Town theme works for the opposite reason. Its melody is purposely unresolved. It moves through its loop without landing comfortably anywhere, without the satisfying harmonic resolution that most music provides. It keeps the listener in a state of gentle suspension, not quite at rest, not quite anxious, somewhere in between, waiting for something that never quite arrives. The music of Gold and Silver introduced composer Ichino's Go alongside Masuda, and the two together created a soundtrack that, by the Game Boy Color's improved but still significantly constrained hardware, achieved something close to lushness within those constraints. The Ecruteak City theme remains one of the most frequently cited examples of video game music evoking atmosphere perfectly. A piece that communicates antiquity and mystery and a specific quality of melancholy that matches exactly the town it accompanies, with its old towers and its shrouded history. These pieces of music are not incidental to the games. They are not background. They are the emotional infrastructure of the experience. They tell you how to feel about where you are and what's happening, and they do it with such consistency and precision that players who return to towns from their childhood Pokemon memories experience the music and the plays simultaneously, inseparably, as a single composite sensation. Nostalgia for Pokemon is frequently also nostalgia for specific pieces of music. The town theme from your first game, the route that you ran along in the rain that one afternoon, the battle theme that played while you finally beat the gym you'd been struggling with for a week. The music is where a large portion of Pokemon's emotional meaning lives. And the people who made it, working with 4 channels and limited memory and hardware that was obsolete almost immediately after the games shipped, produced something that has outlasted the hardware by 30 years and shows no sign of fading. There's one final musical detail worth carrying into the night with you, because it closes something that we opened early in our journey: the Poke Flute. In the original games, the Poke Flute is used to wake a sleeping Snorlax that blocks a path. You obtain it from Mr. Fuji after rescuing him from Pokemon Tower, and when you play it near the sleeping Snorlax, the melody wakes it and you can battle it. The Snorlax encounters are among the most memorable in the original games. Those enormous, sleepy creatures blocking the road, requiring a specific item to approach, rewarding careful preparation. The melody of the Poke Flute is not arbitrary. Junichi Masuda based it on the structure of traditional Japanese lullabies, specifically the interval patterns that recur in Japanese folk music associated with sleep and gentle waking. The melody that wakes Snorlax is, structurally, a lullaby. The same kind of music you might sing to a child who needed to be soothed to sleep is transposed into the game. World, the music that calls a sleeping giant back to wakefulness. There is something beautiful in that. The same musical gesture that brings rest also, in the right context, brings awakening. The lullaby and the reveille are made of the same notes. The distinction between sleeping and waking in the Pokemon world is more permeable than it might appear. And perhaps that's the right thought to carry into the small hours. The world you've been traveling through tonight, the real history, the invented myths, the dark truths, the hidden beauties, is a world that lives in the exact same space as your sleeping mind. It is vivid while you visit it, and it fades and shifts when you aren't looking at it directly, the way dreams do, the way memory does. You don't need to hold on to any of it tonight. Let it all float in the loose, easy way that things float when you're at the edge of sleep. Not gripped, not examined, just present. Just there, at the edge of thought, moving gently. The unknown on the walls of the ruins. The music that knows what time it is. The man on the mountain who used to be you. The truck by the harbor that contains nothing and means everything. The field that was paved over and the field that was built to replace it. And all the creatures living in the tall grass of a world that exists in a wire, in a cartridge. In the 30 years of shared memory carried by everyone who pressed A on their first Pokemon and felt, in that moment, the beginning of something. Sleep now. You've been walking a long time. Rest. If these stories kept you company tonight, please consider subscribing to Unclock You on Poke and leaving a comment. I'd genuinely love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what mystery you want to explore next time. There are so many more to tell. Until then, good night. A note on the journey. There is something worth saying about the way you've moved through this material tonight, because the experience of listening to it at this hour, in the dark, with the day finished and your body ready for sleep, is meaningfully different from reading about Pokemon in daylight. The mysteries we've covered are all real in the sense that I've described them accurately. The Mew glitch works the way I described. The Space World demo leaked the way I described. The Porygon incident caused the hospitalizations I mentioned. The Pokédex entries for Drifloon and Yamask and Phantump contain exactly what I said they contain. But there's another kind of reality these stories take on when they're encountered at this hour, in this way, at this pace. The slow exploration of hidden things, in the dark, while your mind is loosening towards sleep, does something to the material that a brisk daylight Wikipedia scan does not. The gaps become more interesting. The unanswered questions feel more comfortable rather than less. The Great War Theory and the Mew Ditto Theory and the connection between Cubone and Kangaskhan. don't need to be confirmed by Game Freak to be worth sitting with in the quiet. They are good theories. They are the kind of thinking that arises when people who love something look at it carefully and notice that the pieces suggest a pattern. That act of careful attention, the act of loving something enough to look at it very closely and ask what it means, is the act that produced the competitive meta and the glitch research community and the extensive fan theories and all the rest of it. It is the same act that produced the playground myths, even though those myths were wrong about their specific claims. The instinct behind them was right. Something this rich must have more in it than anyone has found yet. That instinct has always been correct. There's always more. Generation after generation, new games reveal new depths, new mysteries, new dark Pokédex entries, new scrapped designs found in leaked demos, new pieces of music that do something specific to the space behind your sternum. The franchise keeps growing, and the world keeps opening, and there is always, somewhere in the tall grass, one more thing waiting to be found. That is Satoshi Tajiri's real gift. Not just the world he built, but the principle at its heart. Keep looking. Keep paying attention. The field rewards those who move through it carefully, who kneel down and look closely, who understand that the ordinary grass conceals extraordinary things if you know how to look. Keep looking. And for tonight, let your eyes close, let the grass grow still. Let the cries of creatures in the digital dark fade to a soft background murmur, and rest. Tomorrow, the field will still be there.